Hello and welcome to episode number 117 of Killer POV. I'm one of your hosts, Rob Galluzzo.
And you're a real fan, Rob, because I saw just now you were looking up our old episodes, which makes me think you can't get enough.
You're like listening to episodes while making new ones.
You gave away my secret.
Oh, okay.
I always have the episode number written, but for some reason, as soon as the music starts, I doubt myself. So I go on our page to make sure that, wait, we are on 117.
Quiz us.
Right?
Oh, I was about to say quiz us, and I bet I wouldn't even probably be within 10.
Somebody quizzed me at trivia night last time, and they were like, and what number is this, Bekah? And I was like, 33rd and a third.
All right, well, the man giving away all my secrets is Elric Kane.
That's what I do. I'm a mythbuster, just like Houdini. We were just discussing that. It'll tie in later.
And also with us is Rebekah McKendry.
What up?
Hello. Alrighty. Well, we're gonna get into literary horror today. Very excited. Got a great guest specifically for that topic that I think is going to be good.
And books about horror, right?
And books about horror.
Because there's been some good ones.
So much to see.
I didn't write those down. I must jot some down. Some favorites right now.
Okay.
Actually, this is perfect because somebody had reached out to us on the Facebook page, one of our listeners, asking for I forgot where he's from, but he was asking for recommendations on like books about horror, like reference books, and I'm like, you know what? Tonight's going to be the night.
Yeah, there was a period where that's all I read for a long time. I don't know why. I just went into
it. It was right when I was in college and I made the decision that like fuck it, I just want to do horror instead of Italian neoclassical realism or whatever it was. And all I did, because I wasn't getting them in my classes, I just started picking up every kind of nerdy horror nonfiction history of horror book I could find and just reading them cover to cover. And that's honestly where a huge amount of my like horror education came from, was just reading on my own accord about it.
Mine just came from the Psychotronic Film Guide by Michael J. Weldon. I didn't need any of those fancy books from libraries. I had the book.
Psychotronic Film Guide.
It really is a great book.
Video, or what were they called? Like Video Hounds? A Guide to Horror.
I remember having Video Hounds.
I had his cult film book and the horror book, and I read those cover to cover and would go through and actually put like check marks after I'd watched the films.
Found one. Yeah.
I feel like somebody like a website should do something like that again, like a new version of that, but on the web, just like really short, nice.
IMDb?
Yeah, but they're not fun reviews. I mean, like people don't know that, but if you go back and open Psychotronic Film Guide, it's the actual like brief reviews themselves that are what make it gold.
Yeah.
I mean, it's hilarious the way they write, and they're very short, and they kind of just they cut right to the chase.
Right.
Kind of like what Joe Bob Briggs did, on his show when he'd kind of review the things with the stars or how many heads were cut off.
And I liked that they gave them like bone rating system, because I could read it and be like, Invasion of the Love Drones, that sounds amazing. Oh, they only gave it like a quarter of a bone. That means it's really quite bad, actually. So then I wouldn't like pursue
you don't want
one.
a quarter of a bone in
really,
that book.
I don't go for quarter bones, guys.
I'm really looking forward to Brian Collins' book, because he's doing a horror movie day book. And I mean, I've read a lot of the reviews, or at least the reviews of movies I was curious about, but it'll be fun to see them all kind of collected together.
I'm glad he's doing something with that.
I think it's just a digital book. I don't know if he's going to do a hard release of it.
I've always wanted something on my shelf on Kathy's Curse. I'm really bummed I'm not going to have it on my shelf.
We had to convince him to make it a hard release as well, if possible.
I had a friend who had never seen Shocker. He'll go unnamed, and he just wrote to me yesterday. He's like, after we're listening to a Wes Craven episode, he's like, I just finally saw Shocker. Oh my God, it's so bad. It was just one of the worst. It's like, I'll leave him unnamed.
Wow,
He's listening.
Okay, well...
he knows who he is.
A tear just went down Brian Collins' cheek.
Yeah.
Oh, and congrats, hold on, just quick congrats, because I know he listens. Our guest last week, Nick Simon, whose film premiered last night at TIFF. And then tonight...
The Girl in the Photographs.
Girl in the Photographs. And then also another previous guest, Joe Begas' film, premiered last night. And both very different tonally films. Joe's probably more of a midnight movie.
Yeah, can't wait to see it.
Nick's more of a slow burn, but
yeah, looking forward to both
good for you
of them.
guys. Congrats.
So I only saw a couple of little things, but I think we should talk about the movie that all three of us saw this weekend.
Did we all see a film?
It's called
It was my second time.
Oh, okay. Yeah, got it.
Elric, I'm dying.
You want to hear my side first?
I'm dying to know what you think.
Everything I hate about a movie on paper, this one had M. Night Shyamalan, found footage, lead protagonists who are kids who are also like speak with adult voices and are rambunctious know-it-alls, and yet somehow like it was like deeply entertaining. Honestly, it was probably M. Night's best film outside Sixth Sense, and I was sitting. Now, part of it, I'll say this: if you see this movie in a really packed theater, it is an experience. I mean, I haven't had such a theater experience experience for maybe a couple years, because the guy next to me was on a date and he literally leaped out of his chair. And then in the next second was the people are laughing. Like, it plays like this mainstream comedy. Then people are jumping out of their seat. And the best thing, I will say this, I almost didn't go because, you know, my trailer phobia, and that trailer I haven't been able to avoid because it's been on TV. And I really felt, I was watching it. I think I was about 30 minutes in. I was going, this is good. But it was confirming my worst fears that everything in the trailer is all I was going to get. And then it just kept going. And then there's a good, like, 5 or 6 other great things that happen that aren't in the trailer. So for those who are, you know, reticent to see it, go for it. Because, you know, I was so relieved when that was the case that it had more to it than just all those moments in the trailer. Because you kind of get to that point, you're like, oh, is that it? Okay, that's cool. But so I don't know. I was surprised. I couldn't have been more surprised. Also, I saw Matt Carey-Holmes, who loved it.
Are you serious? I was expecting Matt to tear it apart. Script problems.
He wasn't. He loved the kid. You know what I think it is? Because other friends like Jackson Stewart really didn't care for it at all. And the one thing I've heard is if you didn't buy into the kids. Yeah. So Jackson said he didn't like the boy at all, and whereas Matt was dying every time the kid rapped or whatever.
I mean, he rapped.
So I think that's, if you buy into them as, you know, the girl had one too many mise en scène quotes for my take of it. That
was hilarious.
But it was still fun. But
that's so funny. Yeah, you know, it's funny because had I been giving this review on Saturday, the day after, I saw it Friday night. And had I been talking, because when I saw it initially, my initial thought is that I loved 75% of it and absolutely hated 25% of it. And most of that 25% is in the ending, like the third act, the way that things unfolded. And that was just my initial while I'm watching it. And again, it's because I know how great M. Night was and could be, you know? So I'm watching this movie, I was like, I don't understand. Is he in on the joke or whatever? But the more I thought about it, the more I couldn't stop laughing. And I was like, but I can't stop thinking about this movie.
There's a lot of moments in it.
All those things that I didn't think I liked, like the humor and stuff like that, and the really bizarre, like, I mean, the end credits rap is just like, I couldn't believe what I was seeing. And then I think that's the thing is, the more I thought about it, like, afterwards, I was like, the fact that I couldn't believe that happened makes me kind of appreciate it.
I just thought it was really well written.
It's definitely the best he's done in a long, long time.
And it's one of the best directed found footage films I've seen, because it's always, it really justified things in a way that it's very hard to do now. I mean, it's definitely, you know, we're at the end of what any of us can take with that kind of. And yet I didn't, once I bought into it, I didn't think about it again, you know? And in fact, it has probably the best scare in the whole movie is, you know, like planting a camera and something happening to that planted camera. I literally saw people bounce like out of their seat. It was pretty amazing.
I saw it at the Victory 8 with like the awesome leather seats that you can recline and you're like pretty much laying down. It's kind of awesome. I highly recommend that theater. But when I saw it there, the scene, and it was completely full, like it was a sold out house on Saturday night. And the scene that had everybody going was the one where they're under the house.
Oh yeah, the whole hiding scene.
Which is early.
It's excellent.
It's early, but everybody was freaking out about it.
No, I actually think that was one of my favorite scenes.
Great scene,
The thing about it is the reason, whether you trust us or not on this recommendation, you might have seen the trailer and been like, oh God. But that's how I felt. The cool thing is there really are other surprises in this film. And there's actually some really interesting twists that whether you see them coming or not as you're watching, they're interesting. I think they're pretty well deserved. And I think it's just an entertaining film. It's the funny thing, it's just not my kind of horror film, and yet it won me over. So that's a good sign.
I'm so shocked that you love it.
I really enjoyed it. It's
everything that you hate.
Yeah, I mean, there you go.
And I'm in the half and half minority where I sort of like it, but I don't. But again, like you just said, I think because it's so entertaining, like even the stuff I don't like is just funny to me.
And it's performances. I mean, the older woman just knocks it out of the park. It's like one of those. Just her. It's like that and Deborah Logan from the last couple of years. Both those roles were just incredible.
You didn't find certain things, you know, obvious? Because I don't know if that was the intent. Like sometimes
in terms of twist, or
not just the twist, but even like just how heavy-handed a lot of.
I think because of the humor, I didn't care because it's so weird. Once your expectations, once you know what your expectations are, like mine shifted once I sat down and kind of saw what it was. I realized, oh, this isn't just like the kind of horror film that like Under the Skin or one of those movies that I'm gonna become obsessed by. But instead, it just became an entertaining, pleasurable film.
Popcorn,
exactly. But a really, you know, a really well made one, I thought.
Yeah.
So I'm very curious to see how general public.
I know.
Because I can't tell if people are going to love it or hate it. Because I heard there was 2 cuts, a comedy cut and a scarier
really?
cut.
Yeah, the cut
That's
that
what I had heard.
saw first was a little bit different than the one that I saw second.
I heard it was like a pure comedy cut. There was like a cut that was literally, it's basically a comedy with some scary parts. And then the one we saw is definitely a 50-50.
Right.
mix.
Interesting.
That's
Interesting.
what Matt said. You guys can find out because of where you work.
I'll see. We haven't.
We'll investigate.
We'll see.
Investigate
or
this.
we could, just ask somebody in a couple of weeks.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
See.
Yeah. We'll see if
he'll
divulge the details.
Cool. Maybe Ryan's coming back.
All right.
So you like that one as well?
I did. Yeah. I'm with Rob where I liked 90% of it. And then about 10% I was like, God, just make the kids stop rapping. But
I didn't mind that. The kid was fun.
I liked the rapping more. Well, I can't say I liked it. I tolerated the rapping more than I did her little film terminology stuff.
It's good at the start, but it runs a little thin.
It gets a little taxing. And so that's where my 10% dislike comes in is just her and her very I'm a film student style.
Yeah, no, I think a lot of it's performance based. Mm-hmm. It's strong.
The kids looked a lot like the mom though. Mm-hmm. That was pretty spot on casting. Weird. When you get an actress, because I recognize the mom. I forget her name, but she
does a lot of comedy
stuff.
Films,
yeah, I was like, oh God, these look like they could totally be her kids.
Catherine Hahn, I think.
Yeah, I think so. I only saw 2 other things really quickly. So I saw The Legacy, which Scream Factory put out on Blu-ray.
Looking forward to seeing that.
I've never seen it before.
Sam Waterston?
No, Sam Elliott.
Sam Elliott, yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah. I'm thinking mustache.
Sam Elliott.
Sometimes you eat the bar, sometimes the bear too.
Captain Ross, Roger Daltrey's in the movie, and it was directed by the guy that did Return of the Jedi.
Oh, yeah.
It was cool.
Irvin Kershner?
No. He was
he's number 2.
2, yeah. I'm drawing a blank right now, but no, I really liked the film a lot. I didn't know what to expect from it. It's very much like last week I watched The Sentinel. It was just great. These are 2 movies I heard of, and I didn't understand the cover with the cat on it. I was like, but it does play into the plot of the movie. But yeah, it's essentially Sam Elliott and his girlfriend. I guess she gets offered a job, a too good to be true, we'll give you a $50,000 advance if you come to London to do this job sort of deal. And they decide to come out a little bit earlier just to kind of enjoy the countryside and all that. And they kind of have an accident and just end up in this super rich guy's mansion. And once they're there, they kind of can't leave. It's all this weird, 6 guests show up all of a sudden. You're like, what the hell's going on here? And then the guy disappears, and it's kind of there's a nurse that is kind of in charge of the house, and anytime they try to leave, there's always some sort of excuse your motorcycle's still up for repairs. Our chauffeur's not here right now, but he'll take you later. And it's fun because Sam Elliott's not having any of it, and I gotta find more movies of him from that period because he's so badass. He's got the perfect mustache. Yeah. He's just he's the epitome of a man's man that I would think of from late 70s movies. So it's pretty interesting.
I'll borrow from
not necessarily scary, it's just weird.
Yeah.
Weird and
it sounds like
fascinating.
If anyone watches Buñuel films, there's a film called Discreet Charm of the Bourgeoisie where they just can't ever leave the party.
Mm-hmm.
It keeps going in
much,
surreal off. Yeah,
it's very similar to that. I mean, they do sort of deviate a little bit from, but that's pretty much what it's like. But yeah, I liked it.
Sounds fun.
Sentinel's way more crazy.
Yeah, Sentinel's a great movie. I got to borrow that. I want to see that Blu-ray.
Yeah, I need to watch it again because I told Rob yesterday the only thing I remember is Burgess Meredith throws a birthday party for his cat.
That's the Sentinel.
That is the Sentinel. That's all I got though.
And the cat should have been on the cover of Sentinel too. You could have had 2 cat movies.
Hey,
that could have been pretty good.
Well, they did come out really close together, so there's that, of course. The director was Richard Marquand.
Marquand.
Yeah, and he passed away fairly young, in his late 40s. Oh, it says here, in 1987 at age 49.
Wait, when was Jedi? 86?
83. Right before that,
that makes sense.
And the last thing I just want to mention, which is piggybacking off last week's episode, is after you talked about New Nightmare so extensively and with such high praise, I went back to that one in particular because again, it was
first half.
Yeah, I think I agree with you. It's fascinating in theory and on paper.
Yeah,
that movie. I'm sure if I read that script, I'd think it's terrific. And I think you were spot on. It's the first hour when you're, it really was the precursor to Scream. It was Wes experimenting. Yeah, the look,
aesthetic of his
the shot. The worst thing in it, and I have to blame K&B because I think they were responsible for it. but their Freddy design in it is awful. And that's what ruins the whole movie, is because, you know, the way they're building up the mythology, like, you know, Wes is saying, like, well, you know, there's a, you know, you can dream up something that's pure evil, and sometimes it kind of gets captured by something in pop culture. And in this case, it's like, you know, they're trying to say that the quote unquote real Freddy is like just an evil entity that is taking this persona because it's so popular with pop culture, which is a fascinating idea. Yeah. But, you know, when you see the real one in your dreams, he's far scarier than the Freddy we've seen in the movies. And then you see him and he just looks like a guy wearing a mask. Like, you know, it's just, it looks awful. He looks like a Mighty Morphin Power Ranger villain. Yeah, that's the only thing I could say about it. Yeah. Even as good as, I mean, even the hand looks, I love the idea of like this new mechanical kind of claw that he's got. Right. When you look at it, and it looks like a rubber prop.
Well, that's why that first hour is quite good, because it sets things up.
You see, get to that,
you have the nightmare with the hand. You have them making a movie. Yeah. She's got a stalker. There's weird earthquakes happening.
All that stuff is interesting.
And especially the scene where he goes out in front of the crowd and you see the popularity of Freddy versus the final girl. Yeah. And she feels a little, like the things that are actually coming from probably the truth of the situation. I love that stuff. I think it's very nuanced.
What's also amazing to me is that, I don't know why, but I always pictured New Nightmare way after the Nightmare franchise was over. But, you know, because they mentioned that scene where Heather goes on the show and Robert Englund shows up. They're like, oh, we're celebrating the 10th anniversary of Nightmare on Elm Street. Yeah, you're like, holy shit, this was 94. Like, this was right. Maybe
I saw that in the theaters, though. I remember seeing it.
Oh, 90, Freddy's Dead was 91. So this is like 3 years after the last one. And I don't know. I mean, because now it's like you're celebrating the 25th, 30th anniversary of it at this point. That even New Nightmare is 20 years old now, which is crazy. But no, it's an interesting film. I don't think it 100% works, but it's fascinating to see it in the context of Wes's filmography and what came before and what came right after, obviously. So yeah, it was really cool.
Did you see Cinefamily next week's going to play 3 of the earliest Wes films?
Yeah, I heard that.
I'm very tempted to go see them on Last House, Hills of Eyes, and The Stranger in the House, the TV one that he did on 16 millimeter. And I'm really tempted to see those 3 together, because even Last House and Hills, I think I've always wanted to see them on screen because they are hard to watch.
Be fun, but I think Last House would be really hard.
But in a theater, I think it might be interesting. Just like because Cannibal Holocaust was interesting in a theater, and that's a movie I doubt I would have enjoyed seeing at home. There's something about those. You know, it's almost like a group therapy. We can collectively bond through our misery. You know?
Yeah, and it looks like there's going to be something at Beyond Fest. They teased a red and green image today on their Instagram page.
So. Like with just one more thing that hasn't happened
they're
yet.
adding another tribute of some sort.
So I wonder what could be.
Yeah.
I'm pretty psyched about some of the stuff at Beyond Fest.
Probably a Nightmare movie.
But I mean, what could, I guess the first one would.
We'll probably know by the time this airs.
Okay, fair enough.
What'd you guys see?
So I've been working on a project for Blumhouse on elderly films, something separate from The Visit, but correlated too. So I've been going back and watching horror movies with elderly characters.
Homebodies? Did you ever see
Homebodies? That's actually one of the ones
Retirement
I watched.
Village. I haven't seen that. I'm curious to see that.
Talk about it. It's from 1974, and it's essentially it's set in a city, and a group of pensioners all live in this kind of like building. The building's run down and falling apart anyway, but these kind of greedy developers decide that they're going to kick everybody out and redo the building into, I think it's condos or something. And so all of the old people start killing everybody.
I've always heard it's pretty good.
Homebodies.
It played at...
That sounds good.
Yeah,
how did I hear of it? When Cinefamily did that thing where it was like the United States of Horror.
Yeah.
As every state was represented. That was one of the obscure states.
Yeah, it's not very well known, and I definitely had to like hunt to find a copy of it, and the copy I ended up finding was this god-awful transfer that made it painful to watch, so I hope there's a better one out there somewhere. But it was fun. I can understand why it may not be popular, because there's a certain uncomfortableness to watching these like sweet old ladies like slit people's throats, to the point where it's kind of like, because they're so sweet, and you know, it's almost like a rape revenge film where you're like, well, they're justified, you know, like it's okay that they're doing this. So it's definitely an interesting movie. I could see why some people might like it, but if you're a horror fan, you need to check it out just for it's definitely worth a look. I also watched 1987's Flowers in the Attic. which I have not seen since I was a kid. And I used to really like this movie when I was a kid. And it's one that I'm like, I don't know why I liked this movie so much when I was a kid. It's total like pulpy, just sleaze. It's kind of fun in that regard. But I mean, I remembered it being much more of a horror film from when I was a kid, like borderline like a fantasy fairy tale. And I'm watching it this time and I'm like, so the mom and grandma are abusive. The kids are obviously having this like incestual fucking, and they're trying to kill the kids. And then the kids kill the grandma and the mom. And it's just like, okay, this is like pure pulp. So I just found out a couple of days ago that they did a newer one with Kathy Bates and a few other notable people.
Like Heather Graham.
Heather Graham was in it as the mom. And so I kind of need to see this again. But I had to go back.
There's nothing scary about Heather Graham. There's a whole lot of other things I could say, but nothing scary.
I had to go back to the 1987 one that I'd always seen, which had the lovely Christy Swanson as the daughter in it. So
see, that's the danger of revisiting movies like that you have a memory of as being scary or a horror movie.
They're usually those horror films that were aimed more at younger people, and so they're terrifying to you. Or TV movies are often that way, I find. They're really scary when you saw them on TV live without any context, but later on you're like, oh, okay, it's a pretty bad TV movie.
But I liked that movie enough when I was a kid that it made me read a couple of the other V.C. Andrew novels, which I don't remember being good. Like I read Petals in the Wind and Thorns on something. I don't recall them as being good, but I read them just because I enjoyed the movie of Flowers in the Attic so much. So
it's going to be awkward when V.C. Andrews is our guest later on today. Did you see, because I was just looking it up, one of my favorites from, I think I talked about it last year, but it's an Australian one by a New Zealand director called Next of Kin. And it's set in a retirement village.
I have the VHS tape of it, but I haven't seen it yet.
If you're working on something, you have to watch it because it's somebody's drowning the old people, and it's got these really trippy slow motion death scenes that are happening throughout, and it ends in this just has a crazy last 20 minutes. It's a pretty slow movie otherwise, but it's one of the only ones I've seen set in that location of people are getting older and kind of being put out to pasture, and just somebody's speeding up the process a tad.
I also watched like Drag Me to Hell and some of the more kind
Bubba Hotep
standard
Bubba Hotep.
I didn't include Bubba Hotep because the old people in that are not the scary ones. This was like the older people.
Oh, you want the older people to be the villains?
They had to be. It's in regards to the visits. So the older people had to be the terrifying ones. So
I can't remember if the next one.
Aside from all of my old folks movies, and this is weird for me, I quit watching Bones like years ago because it kind of became really campy, and I wasn't buying it anymore. It's like now they've discovered a corpse at a circus, so we're doing a circus themed episode and things like that.
Oh, I thought you were talking about the Snoop Dogg movie.
No. The Legend of Jimmy Bones. Didn't we meet the writer of that a couple of weeks
Adam
ago?
Simon
I was going to say, we had him on. But the TV show Bones, which I was fascinated about at first because it's all about corpses and autopsies and how you catch killers when all you have is like a femur and things like that. And it used to be really fascinating. And then I quit watching for a long stretch. And some reason this past weekend, I was on a treadmill and I was like, fuck it, I'll watch Bones. And so I started back and started watching again. And I've been like binge watching it for the past 3 days. And though I can't say that it's the greatest TV show ever, it is rather fascinating. And the effects in it are amazing. Like the corpses and gore, it's always way over the top.
Bekah's got a Borean's boner. That's what it is.
He's not my favorite character.
Oh, wow. All right.
Nah.
Who else is on that show?
I don't even know their names.
The New Girl's sister is on it. I know that.
Yeah.
The girl from New Girl, her sister.
Temperance Brennan.
That's all I know.
I only know their character names because I never research people past the show for this. And plus I just got back into it 3 days ago, so I'm a little behind.
Okay.
But yeah, so I've been binge watching this, and a lot of the, because I got really fascinated. Here's what I do research. I got fascinated by the gore effects. And so then I started researching like where they're getting their skeletons and their corpses from. Many of them are coming from Dapper Cadaver, who is like a friend of ours that we should have on the show at some point. So
I think that's in their advertising.
Excellent job.
When you rent something from Dapper, I think it's on the back. I think Dexter had something for Dexter at some point.
Right.
A lot of Bones, a lot of,
They're a shop based out here, right?
Yeah, they're in Sun Valley.
Listening now.
Yeah.
But I haven't been there for a long time, but when I started the show This Week in Horror way back when with Stacy, I would take my own paycheck from producing these shows at This Weekend, and I would travel, and they were in Santa Monica. I would drive all the way. This first time I'd even been in the Valley, in all honesty. I'd drive all the way from Santa Monica to out here in the Valley to rent something every show that would set the set apart, so whether it was, whatever our theme was, so if it's birds or gravestones or a corpse, and it was a lot of fun. I actually was one of the things I missed as we went to Inside Horror, where it was just a lot colder a set. It wasn't as playful. But yeah, they did good deals and stuff. They're good people.
For anybody visiting LA, like just as a tourist, I highly recommend going by Dapper Cadaver, because they've expanded their shop now, and it's like a museum. Like they have the dinosaur room and the oddities room and the aliens room, and it's really badass, and the corpses room. And now I know where Bones gets all of its stuff from.
Wow.
So yeah, so that was my week. Oh, and just today, and I'll report on this next week, but I'm really excited. I just got a copy of the Blu-ray for Burn Witch Burn, also known as Night of the Eagle today. And so I've
seen the cover before.
Really excited to check that one out, because I've heard really good stuff and I've never seen it.
I saw one other movie. It was my first revisit since a year and a half. It Follows. I revisited finally. So I only saw it in theaters, AFI.
Do you mean that we're going to talk about this movie
Don't
again?
Make me talk about It Follows again.
I've been fighting on Twitter with
What
Matt.
more do you have to say?
I think it's a better movie than I thought it was the first time. It wasn't as scary this time.
I got to revisit it too.
It's really strong, and I love the criticisms that I actually watched it like completely in mind. Like anything I'd heard someone say, like they keep shifting the rules or this or that, and I'm like, not one of those things holds up. And Matt will be pulling out it's ludicrous. It's like they're teenagers making teenager choices. It's not the writer like accidentally dropping the ball at any point of the story. I think it's a really tight, really interesting. Have you watched it again?
Is this new? I watched it twice. Okay. I watched it, but both times were in the theater, where I saw it with you at AFI, and then like months later when it went like full theatrical, I saw it again.
Damn it. Are you going to make me go home and watch this tonight?
No, I don't know what it is. There's something, I think it's aesthetic. I think it's definitely an aesthetic thing that's pulling me into it. There's moments that I really love where it'll have a shot directly from above looking down at the thing the characters are looking at. So like it's her hands on a plant or something before she gets drugged. And there's something about it just grabs me. It's
a
interesting.
Total Elric film.
Yeah, it is. But I also watched it with Selena, who never watches horror films because they freak her out too much. And I saw just how
your wife, just so people know who you're talking about,
how well the movie plays, right? To somebody who like she was like it was just like cranking someone into a ball of nerves, and so. To horror fans, I can't speak to how you guys watch them, whether it's going to work on you, but to watch it play out on someone who knows nothing about it and hasn't really seen it, can't really watch them because they get under her skin too much. She'll go to bed that night thinking about it. Like, I'm not like that. I can let it go straight away. Yeah. So I can see why somebody wouldn't want to watch too many if it affects them. And I could just see it. I was making it worse going, oh, you're fine for the next few minutes. Oh, this next part? Yeah, it's really bad. And I'm thinking the part with the giant and stuff. But she actually handled it well, but it was fun to watch and it made me enjoy the process. But on a narrative, there's just little flourishes, and I think again it's that it felt like it didn't feel like another horror film. Like, yes, it has shades of Nightmare, shades of Blue Velvet, shades of all these things, but it also felt like a movie made by someone who may or may not even be a horror fan. I don't know, but it had a different feel to it than other films I've seen, and whatever that's I guess what I'm often looking for, to feel something different, so it really held up for me. I'm curious
how you convinced Selena to watch a horror film with you.
Because I watched some crappy chick flick before.
Okay.
It was a trade-off. Is what you do when you're married.
I've been inviting her to come to screenings with us for a while, and she's never.
She used to. When I first met her, we watched the Devil's Reject, things like that. When we first met, watched a bunch of these movies, and as I got to know her, I realized they stayed with her longer, and you actually don't want to be around somebody when they suffer from horror films. It's interesting, but anyway. So it still retains its position as my favorite of the year, though I haven't seen The Witch, and I have a feeling The Witch might be one that, and I haven't seen Goodnight Mommy, which I really wanted to go see. Yeah, so I've still got good stuff to see this year, but I really like it.
Cool. Yeah. Well, we will be back with our guest momentarily.
VC Andrews coming up.
Okay, so we're back, and shocking news just in that apparently VC Andrews is dead.
Devastated.
Devastated. So that is actually not our guest today.
I heard she's still actually writing stories.
She's dead, but on Twitter, which is something better than nothing.
No, our real guest is here, who is way better than that. Somebody we've been wanting to do. We've never, now we're getting into the point where we've done 100 plus episodes. There's little topics and things we've always wanted to tackle, but we always wait for the timing or either the right guest and all that. And we knew that if we were ever going to do a horror literary kind of episode, that this was the guy we were going to have on. I'd like to welcome to the show, Del Howison.
Hey, great to be here.
All right. And for those of you that are Los Angeles natives, you may know Del as the owner of Dark Delicacies, bookstore in Burbank.
Along with my wife, in case she's listening.
Well, with Sue.
Yeah, that's important.
If you walk in, you'll meet either Del or Sue, most likely. How long have you guys been around? It's been
This December will be 21 years.
21 years.
Yeah.
That puts me to shame.
Yeah, that's
my meager 3 years of business.
Yeah.
But a great 3 years they were.
Maybe that's what you get, right? You get
take the good stuff and get out.
Yeah, exactly.
Wow. So 21 years. So, I mean, we obviously know Del through the store, but obviously you're a writer. You've written and produced books. You have the Dark Delecacies anthology series that you do as well. And we'll dig into a lot of the stuff that you've done as well. But just so people get a rough idea of who you are, tell me a little bit about the history of the store, because, before Dark Delicacies opened as a bookstore, what were you doing before that? Were you working at bookstores? Did you, how did that kind of happen?
No, my wife was working at Nestle's USA headquarters in Glendale.
Oh.
And I was working downtown in the Schmata business down there in the clothing industry. I worked down there 16 years.
What's a Schmata business?
Schmata, the clothing business, the manufacture of.
Oh, okay.
So
I've never heard that term before.
So that's what I was doing. In fact, I was still working there when we opened the store.
Would you call yourself the Charles Bukowski of horror?
No.
Okay. Then we'll move on.
So it came out of our own desire, because my wife and I were both into horror, and we wanted to have some tchotchkes around the house that kind of reflected our taste. And we couldn't find anything except that stupid-ass dog with wings that you see, that gargoyle all the time. And
I have one of those in my yard.
Everybody has one. Yeah. It came from Toscano or one of those.
Yeah, I also have the zombie crawling out of the ground from Toscano.
See, that came much later on.
Way
that
later.
was a little bit later.
That was when they figured there was a market for it.
But the Toscano catalog used to be the only horror merch you could get. And so you could get that dog with wings, and they had a couple of dragons, and that was it.
He was a gargoyle.
Yeah.
So we thought there might be other idiots out there like us, and we started scouring catalogs like what you were saying, and you'd find 2 items in a catalog an inch thick, and you wondered what the heck. So we assembled a bunch of stuff together and did a table at a horror convention. Well, at least we were a horror table. I don't know about at the Red Lion Inn, way out in the East Valley somewhere.
Wow!
And we did 2 conventions, and then I said, "Well, this is stupid. Setting up, tearing down, setting up. What a pain in the ass." So we need a store. Mm-hmm. So a couple days later, I came home and I said, "Honey, I found your store," and it was 3 blocks from where we lived. And we rented it, and we started with $5,000 and our own collection. What was your nut? I mean, we didn't even have a loan or anything.
Yeah, no, we were just money that we had, and it went all in at the start. That's kind of the problem. If you put it all in at the start, you have to make money somehow.
Yeah, and it's usually a few days before money starts rolling in. Like a year or so.
But I imagine rents were a lot cheaper back then.
Well, they probably were.
Yeah.
But I was smaller. I'm in my 3rd location now, and every time we've moved, we've grown a little bit. So the location has changed. That's cost more. The area has changed. That's cost more. So
Have you always been in Burbank, though?
Always been in Burbank. Always within 5 blocks. All my stores are within a 5-block area. Huh. They've all been close enough I could walk to them if the car broke down. So.
Nice. It's a good area of Burbank.
I didn't have to go to the grocery store.
I know, you didn't have to do as much driving. I was even running deliveries for a good year. So, yeah.
So the goal was always not just a bookstore, but a store that had horror fiction, but as well as tchotchkes and just weird kind of interesting horror themed things.
I mean, it was supposed to be based as a bookstore.
Right.
And that kind of changed over time. Kind of like my son is a partner in a comic book place called Emerald Knights.
Right.
Oh, yeah.
And they started thinking they were a comic book store that also sold games, and now they're a gaming store that has comics.
Right.
And we're kind of like a horror store that has books.
Yeah.
It kind of changes, time change, because we ran into things like we were prior to Borders and Barnes and Noble. So then you got the big box stores came in, and they were beating up all the independent bookstores. And then you had the web, and Amazon showed up, and they were beating up all the bookstores. So you had to find ways to survive when the big box stores came in, the way to survive was to specialize, which is what we had done.
Right.
But when Amazon came along and Jeff Bezos, or whatever his name is there, he actually said his intent was to put all the bookstores out of business.
No.
So when you got that gauntlet thrown, you got to find ways to get around it. That's
Right.
Yeah, and it must be so hard when they are just, like Amazon can always just go, yep, that's $5 cheaper than anywhere. It's a mindset you have to change, which I only just recently, after all the dust settled, I only finally got a little mad, where I was like, well, you know what? You have to be willing to spend $2 more, walk 2 blocks further, and sometimes just sweat a little more if you want those options. Otherwise, they're gone.
Yeah, but
it's just inevitable. They're all gone.
I don't know.
It'll just happen.
I don't float on Amazon. That's like the biggest difference that I've noticed is I don't discover cool things on Amazon.
Oh, no. You won't discover it.
This is the book I want. I'm going to go here. It's $3. I have ordered it. It will be at my house tomorrow. Whereas shops like Dark Delecacies, or like I go to Bookfellows in Glendale. It's a favorite shop of mine. I love that place because I will just walk in being like, I'm going to see what they have today. And I'll leave with like the Killer Crab collection and things like that.
But I don't think that's that common. I mean, I remember, what's the great bookstore up in West Hollywood, up on the Book Spotlight or something like that? It's been there forever. They have the signings of all the authors. I can't remember what it's called. Like David Lynch and all those people go up near all the bar where Johnny Depp played and River Phoenix died. My God.
You mean like up
all
on
these
Sunset?
people sitting here with blank faces on Johnny Depp.
It's one of the best bookstores I've ever been into.
Sunset,
Up by Tower, up that way.
Yeah, it's up on the
wow.
thing. I can't believe I've forgotten it.
There's a Hustler bookstore there, honey. Are you talking about the
it's not
Hustler
Spotlight.
bookstore?
No, geez, I can't.
They always have someone signing something.
They do.
No, they do. But I've been in there, and I'll be looking at some really nice book, and I'll see someone take a photo of that nice book, and you know what they're gonna they're gonna go home, look it up, buy it for $50. And as a there's always the problem with these things. As a consumer, I get it.
I get it.
But as somebody who wants to see the world more interesting,
well, it depends on what your priority is. If your priority is the lowest price, nobody in a brick and mortar is going to touch it.
Yeah.
You just can't. But if you're interested in talking to people who know what their product is and people who can offer suggestions and that kind of thing, then you're in for the experience. Then the store has the upper.
Absolutely.
The upper hand on that.
Yeah, that's why I miss video stores so much. How many great conversations did we all have with video store clerks growing up? Or as a clerk. Yeah, I was a clerk for years.
And as you know, people come into Dark Delecacies and we stand around and talk for hours, and you never know who's going to come in because it's kind of like Horror Central, so it's kind of fun. And you were talking about the psychotronic film
Michael
guy.
J. Weldon,
I put out the Book of Lists, horror, which had everybody in it from Eli Roth to Stephen King to Ray Bradbury. And that book, along with Psychotronic and even Leonard Maltin and all of those, the joy of that is that people will come back later and say, it made me start making my own list of books I want to read or movies I want to see. And that's what you've done, is got them excited about the film.
And it's just one leads to the other. I've spent more hours with Leonard Maltin than probably anything. Back when I was a kid, just looking through. That's fascinating. That's pretty cool.
But the web can do that to you too.
The rabbit hole.
When I was writing my novel, I was doing research because it's a Western, so I wanted everything to be as authentic, not just Hollywood, what I knew in my head. Mm-hmm. So one time I remember I went looking for. There's a female lead, and she takes her cowboy hat off, and I said to myself, she wouldn't wear the same cowboy hat he'd be wearing. What would she be wearing? Not a bonnet. I mean, she was a cow person, if that's a term.
Yes. Yeah.
So I started looking it up, and about 3 hours later, I said to my wife, who's laying on the couch watching TV, do you know there's a snake in Africa that comes because you go down that rabbit hole?
Yeah, that's funny.
It's crazy.
Now, was that the biggest challenge over these years of running business for that long? I mean, I can only imagine how many ups and downs and challenges, but was the online bookstore the biggest one?
It was the biggest universal one that everybody seemed to recognize, customer and store people alike.
Right.
But, and I'm sure you've experienced this, we couldn't have gotten anywhere without the people who were the customers.
Right.
The patrons were they saved the day. They always saved the day. And I think, like with your place, they just appreciate the fact that somebody's doing it.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, and I'm sure if I had announced, we're going to have to go out of business, we're going to have some sort of fundraiser, I'm sure you could do that, and it would have drummed up amazing support. Right. The only reason I didn't do that was if it hadn't been a restaurant, I would have done that. If it hadn't been a community space, I definitely would have done. It was the fact that it was a restaurant, and my theory is ultimately it'll just be back in that place a year from now, and I didn't want to lose people's monies for that reason.
That's exactly my thought. I mean, I could do, if I was going down, I could do a fundraiser for 2 months, and I know that all of the wonderful people who have supported us in the past would be there with $5, $10, $100, whatever it is.
Yeah.
But it's not a sustainable business plan.
Right.
And that's what bothers me. Hey, good, we're here for another year.
Well, that's why it's sad that, our last 3 days in business, best days in the whole 3 years.
Yeah.
Isn't that just crazy when you think about it? And the saddest thing is it happened this weekend. What ticked me off is the bar we did our after trivia event, which is 2 blocks down, closed the same day as us.
God.
And then on Sunday, our baked goods place went under, and it's 2 blocks the other way. And I didn't know about it. They didn't even tell us when we told them. And it was only a couple weeks later. And as they went out, somebody went to Jared Rivet, who listens to the show. He went in and they said to him, it's been the best day we've ever had in business. And you're just like, that. To me, there's something very heartbreaking about that your best day in business is the last day in business. You're like, what does that even mean? But, I'm not meaning, I don't even want it to be negative. I'm just very curious. That kind of longevity is, to me, remarkable in any world. But the fact that it's largely a bookstore, it's kind of mind-blowing in a way.
Yeah, 2 decades is a pretty good run, and we're still running. Don't get the idea we're going anywhere. But I don't think fundraising is a sustainable business plan. So you do other things. You change your mix.
Yeah.
You create memberships. You do all kinds of...
Have you tried something like that?
We do all of that kind of stuff. Yeah.
Do you have memberships now? I think I need a membership.
Yeah, so you can get a membership for like $50, and then you get 10% off everything. We used to do one that was less, but you couldn't get anything off like DVDs and CDs, and there's no margin really in them. But with a $50 membership, we just changed everything to it. You get it off everything, and it allows us to... That, and the website's the other thing that did. It allows us to kind of plan things ahead and know we've got a certain amount of bucks to play with.
That makes sense, yeah.
But my wife, who is more Luddite than I am, when it comes to the computer, we had a website for years and years. I don't know if you guys remember the kind of the purple thing with the front of the store.
Yeah.
But our web person was not in-house. So to get things done, you had to find the free time for them and whatever. And there's, hey, we're adding so-and-so as a guest. We need to put it up right now.
Right.
So my wife decided she was going to do a new website. And, excuse me, and she did it. She sat through it. I listened to all the swearing and all of this kind of stuff that went on. And we wanted a website, too, where we could start putting our product up on it because the old website was basically a schedule of the upcoming signings.
Right.
And it's worked wonderfully. People are responding really good, so we're really happy with that. And every once in a while, you hit a change like that, a membership or a website or something, and you see a change in the business.
Yeah, bump, yeah.
Yeah, but so many times you do something like sales. Sales are the worst thing to raise money in the world.
Yeah.
The psychology of sale is really weird. We could say, this Saturday, 30% off everything. And we'd get, that's cool, that's fine. If I have time, I'll come by.
Yeah.
Or we could say, we've got a bunch of funny money from the toy store, and we put a bill in every envelope. And when you spend $20, you get one of these bills, but you can't open it. You bring it back on that Saturday, and there's a chance there's a 50 in there. People will be flocking in.
Wow.
And, most of it's probably a 1 or a 5, and there's 150 out of 200 of these things, and they're making less money than if they went to the 30% off sale. So
right.
Playing with people's psychology is really weird.
Yeah, that's interesting. When you said signings, when did you, because obviously that's another one of the shifts you did. When was the first signing? How many years ago in your history?
Signings were right from the beginning.
Do you remember the first person who came into
Sarah Karloff.
Oh, wow.
And she was the very first person who signed for us.
Wow.
And in those days, she did it, and then we had another signing the next month. We had one a month, and, we didn't know anybody. Over the years, we've gotten to know people, and, maybe I don't have a contact to so-and-so, but maybe I know Rob, and Rob has a contact to so-and-so. So it's built up over the years. But I don't know if anybody remembers Dangerous Visions bookstore. I used to go there, and they would have signings all the time, and I went, this is a pretty good ticket. It gives people a reason to come back.
Right.
That's the bottom line of any promotion you do. Give them a reason to come. They've been there once. Why do they want to come back?
That's interesting.
It's just getting them in the door.
Have you had people who you revered, and like whether it's horror writers or actors who have just happened to wander and nothing to do with signage over the years where you're like kind of floored by them even coming through there?
Yeah. There's been some kind of cool ones, you know. Bob Dylan.
Oh, what?
Yeah.
What did you have Bob Dylan?
I forgot he's a big horror fan. I know he's a big Vincent Price fan.
Oh, he just walked in.
He just walked in.
Yeah.
The Grammys were in town. That's the nice thing about being in L.A. We were at the old store up on Burbank Boulevard, and he came in with somebody. I don't even know if he's married or not, so it could have been his wife, could have been a girlfriend, could have been a manager. I have no idea. And the two of them kind of walked around, and he picked up like 4 books on hand magic. Oh. And they came up to the counter, and he stayed back. She approached the counter and gave me the books. And I rang him up, and she said, "Do we get a discount?" And I said, "For what?" And she just kind of like, looked behind her and back at me. I'm thinking, like, if I gave everyone in the entertainment business a discount, I'd be out of business tomorrow. So I was feeling pretty fucking smug about myself, And they walk out the door, and I turn and look, and up on my shelf is a bottle of Bob Dylan wine. I probably could have traded a discount to have it signed.
That's funny. Yeah, isn't it funny? I was just talking to somebody about that, how it's funny that the most famous and the richer people get, the more they expect stuff for free. Yeah. It's such a bizarre thing here.
But in all honesty, he didn't ask.
Yeah, I believe that. I think it's handlers usually, probably, but that's really funny. Hugh
Hefner.
Oh, interesting.
He's been in. He always has 2 or 3 guys with him. Like, he picks everything out and walks on, and then the guy in the suit comes up. How much is that? Starts peeling off the money.
Interesting. What kind of stuff in horror was he interested in? I'm curious.
He might have been buying a stuffed animal for somebody or
was
anything.
Was he wearing clothes or still?
He was wearing clothes.
Okay.
Yeah. Kind of hangy jacket clothes,
Just be the
but they were
robe,
clothes.
Yeah. I was like, did he change out of the smoking jacket to like go shopping on Magnolia Boulevard or anything?
Yeah, but it's been interesting, and then a lot of people from horror films or something.
Of course,
you run into and stuff.
Yeah. No, it's always surprising. That was always one of the fun things I'll miss. You just never know who's passing through your halls. But yeah, you always have these great signings. You have a good one coming up that I was requested by one of the desperate authors, Shane Bitterling, who should be ashamed of himself for making me ask. Something to do with 18-wheel.
The 18 Wheels of Horror anthology.
What is that
by
about?
Eric Miller. It's Eric's original idea. Eric did Hell Comes to Hollywood, 2 anthologies. His original idea for this was to start doing books he could sell at truck stops.
Oh.
So he was going to do, and he may still be doing for all I know, an entire line of 18 Wheels of. 18 Wheels of Romance, 18 Wheels of Horror, 18 Wheels of...
That's kind of fun.
So this is the first one in the series. I've got a story in it. Shane does. Thank goodness Shane does. So I have to tell you this. When Shane has a story in a book, everybody in Indiana buys one.
Take that, Bitterling.
He has a huge following and a good-sized family, evidently.
Nice.
So
that's funny. And so are these all stories that take place to truckers or at truck stops? Is that the linking theme?
In trucks.
Yeah,
that's cool. That'd be kind of fun.
Some of those anthology movies we talked about before this stuff, there is a linking theme here.
A connection.
And it is, trucks, truckers, truck stops, as long as it's used in the story somehow. It was like in Hell Comes to Hollywood, it had to be people in the business had to write it, and it had to have something to do about the business in some connection. Yeah,
interesting. Yeah, what's the Duel? I saw Duel not too long ago, and then I was on a road trip, and I went to one of these late night stops where I haven't really seen a truck stop where there was like, I think there must have been like about 30 of those monster 18-wheelers all lined up, and I took a photo of them like in a row, and they looked alive. Like they look like, and then you think about Duel and go, they're terrifying in the sense that they can destroy your car. Like if they don't stop in time, you're done. Like there's something about them. They're just huge. I feel like they're as close as we have to spaceships on Earth. That's all I'm going to say.
Where Stephen King got that idea with the faces on the front of all the trucks.
I'm always intrigued by kind of trucker culture in general. I think it lends itself well to horror because you're sleeping in this isolated pod in the middle of a parking lot. And even just like going to some of the truck stops as I've driven cross country back and forth from my parents' house. You know, you walk in and I remember one it had showers in there, like for the truckers to use. And it had up this giant sign that said, "Our showers are videotaped for your safety." And I was like, I don't even know what I'm more disturbed by. That somebody is videotaping me taking a shower, or that something happened that negated that. That like, this happened, now we have to put video cameras in the shower.
I feel like now we should have done truck stop movie.
You have to figure everybody in there is transient.
Yeah.
So you've got your wallet and whatever. You're not taking it in the shower with you.
You've done some detail research on this. Well, I feel like that was a detail.
One of the great trucker horror books, if nobody's read it, is Ray Garton's Lot Lizards.
Which is a good name.
Lot
Which
Lizards.
is a nickname for, isn't that truck stop prostitutes? Are called lot lizards?
Yeah. So it's about these gals.
Interesting that you know that.
I know, right?
And the showers. You know a lot here.
On my weekends.
Well, you know, usually when we have people on, we, we'll talk. We always like to talk about earliest horror recollections and things like that. And we can touch upon the movie stuff too, but because your area of expertise is books, I think it'd be interesting even for all of us to kind of talk about some of the earliest horror stuff that kind of intrigued us or got us into it. For, people of our age, Stephen King was just a big deal. It's like when I was really young, that was probably the first horror author who I knew by name.
Right.
And, there were movies coming out based on his books and stuff like that. But for you, were you, did you always have an interest in horror even at a young age, reading wise?
I always did. And in fact, that story I was telling you about my wife and I starting the store, at the time, I was a big movie buff. I enjoyed watching the horror films, but she was a big Stephen King buff. So that's how our interests got together in the first place, to kind of do that kind.
Tis the king that brings us together.
Yeah, it's the king. All hail the chief.
He was just on the Colbert Show, and it was really cool to see Stephen King interviewed on like this major, network.
He had just gotten the presidential
He just got the
medal.
president, and he kept pulling it out and like saying, "Hey, Stephen, touch it." And he would go, "No, you can't touch it." But he was in great form, and the coolest thing they did is Colbert put all his books up and stacked them, and it was like maybe like almost a person and a half tall.
Oh, man.
And it just had it, and they cut over to it. And I was like, that's pretty cool.
It's cool.
And Stephen King said the best line he had is they said, your critics weren't always with you. And he goes, you know what? A lot of those critics who didn't like, a lot of them are dead now. and he was right. And he goes, those early critics who didn't like Carrie, a lot of them are dead. And I was like, that's pretty cool. No, he seemed still in good humor, and he said he's going to keep writing till people don't like his stuff.
You know what? Yeah. You write because you have to write.
Yeah,
That's all there
Can we
is to
get
it.
him on the show?
No, never.
Probably not even on this coast.
Unless you're the president or
McGarris.
Or McGarris. Maybe McGarris can go.
But, Stephen King changed the face of horror when he came out. He took it, for the most part, he was one of the first ones that took it out of haunted houses and musty old castles and put it in a sunlit kitchen or living room or something.
Who are having an affair
in a suburban house
right.
or whatever. That horror had always been pretty much the domain of the Gothic kind of thing. And it wasn't until, because Gothic came right up through the early 1900s and stuff. And of course, they're still writing Gothic today, but the first people I know of who weren't writing Gothic that my age could relate to it, it was, oh, look, they drive cars and they, all of this kind of stuff, was like Ira Levin,
Rosemary's Baby,
Robert Bloch, those kind of people. And they were kind of the forerunners. And then when King came along, he really put it in the suburbs, and there we all were. Yeah. So he is very responsible for the change in popularity of horror in general.
Mm-hmm. Do you remember when, because to me, it's like, of course, as a kid, I loved the King stuff, but then when I just first became aware of Clive Barker, to me, that was like literally the next level.
Oh, yeah.
And I think the first thing I read of his was, I didn't do the Books of Blood. I got to that eventually and I loved it, but I think it was The Hellbound Heart, which I found obviously through the Hellraiser movie. But do you remember when Clive Barker kind of first came onto the horror scene? Did it take a little while to get used to him, or was he embraced right away? Because I think that Stephen King quote was really what really pushed him, saying, I've seen the future of horror.
Which is amazing because there's a Stephen King quote for Jack Ketchum also, but he never quite got to the same point, even though he's as fine a writer, Clive, I think, really extra broke on the scene because they put his books out also in mass market. So the first time I read him was in an airport chair waiting for my plane.
Wow.
I'd gone to the thing. There was this, had the King quote on it. You know, it was one of the books of blood. In fact, I think the first one, because it had Pig's Blood Blues in it and all of that.
Isn't that hard to believe, but considering there's nothing more perverted than Clive's stuff. Like, you know what I mean? It's like the total opposite
He
of
was
what you would
much
expect.
more visceral than King, and King
much
is
more
no
grotesque.
lightweight when it comes to that kind of stuff. But even when you're talking about people like, Rosemary's Baby type book, if you think about it, even the movie, it's one of those things where everything happens off stage.
Yeah.
You hear about it.
But that book was huge, right? That book was like a phenomenon. Yeah, that was a big...
But the first thing, after I read book 1 of Books of Blood, I think then I read The Damnation Game.
Yeah, that's my first
That's, to
entry
date,
point,
still my favorite Clive Barker book.
That was actually, if we talk about first books, that's one of the first ones. Like, I'd read King, but that's the first book where I was like, I don't know what this is exactly, but it pulled me in a way that I don't think a movie had even pulled me in, like, because it's layer upon layer.
Right.
And each layer was much darker than the one before. And it's a very unsafe book.
Wow.
Like, you feel not safe reading it. And I was probably like 13 or something.
And it let you know, as opposed to, sorry.
Oh, you're fine.
It also let you know that you're not reading Lovecraft anymore.
Right.
That now you're reading something that could happen to you.
Mine was Thief of Always, which I read in middle school, and I remember that one being like, it completely blew my mind. And I mean, the protagonist in that is like a middle schooler, or he might be in high school. I remember he was really young. But yeah, it's very fantasy oriented, but it's got a lot of horror tones to it as well.
Yeah, his imagination must be pretty much unparalleled. Like, the worlds he's created, like, we've read like these crazy worlds. Yeah, it's like, where someone like Stevens, like you said, he's keeping it very much within the real. I think that's why they're so effective.
Yeah.
Clive, I can't even imagine what that mind's like, you know?
Oh, no, because he writes fantasy and, all of that.
And then the paintings and everything, you know?
I mean, but his work, it spans from things that I have problems getting through myself now because they're so visceral and extreme, to Thief of Always and a Magica, which, I would read Thief of Always to my daughter at some point without even thinking about it. So he's got a couple of books that I would
kind of like King's Eyes of the Dragon or whatever. That would have been one you could read to your kids if you wanted to. But his Aberrat stuff.
I
Aberrat,
loved that book when I was a kid.
Yeah.
I used to have a really beautiful picture book edition that he did all the drawings for. And I loved the pictures in that one.
It was interesting. I remember going to his house one time, and he had 3 houses in a row.
I saw the house, the picture house.
He has the picture house. So you got the office, and you got where he lives, and then you've got where he stores and works on the paintings. And the canvases are like, at that time, I hear it's since been organized. The canvases at that time were just piled against the wall, literally. And he doesn't work on a small canvas. Yeah. He works on canvases that I've seen him jump to get to make a mark at the top of a canvas. So it was crazy. The interesting thing is, I know it happens at our store all the time. People will say, I don't like horror. And the first thing that comes to their mind is, they said horror, they mean slasher. They don't have an idea what psychological horror, supernatural horror, any of that. So in the book world, a lot of what happened to us, because you say, name me some horror writers, and they'll say, oh, King, Kuntz, Rice, Barker, and then they pretty well run out of modern day. And a lot of our job as store owners has been trying to get people to find these other authors who are a lot lesser known, but maybe no less, quality authors in the things. And part of that hindered us is like what killed part of the horror movie thing, is that anyone can pick up a camera and make a horror movie now. They think they throw around a little blood. There it is. With us, it's self-publishing. Anybody who can't get a deal, and in many cases there's a reason they can't get a deal, they still have to get that book out. So they go and get the book published. Not to say all self-published is bad by any means, but the overwhelming majority is not getting picked up by a publisher for a reason. And so people either think horror is bad in film and in book because they encounter this
glut.
The glut. And there's no way to separate it on the web.
Right.
If you go on the web, you can find Peter Straub right next to Joe Blow, and if you don't know which one you're looking for or who the good writer is, you just as well may be picking up Joe Blow instead of Ghost Story by Peter Straub.
That's why you need a guide.
You need a guide, and that's why you get off the web and go to a store where people know what they're talking about. But we do spend a lot of time trying to steer. They go, I've read everything King put out. What else is good? And we go, well, what did you like by King? What was your favorite? What did you like by Barker? And then they tell us, and then we can turn them on to Thomas Tryon or Robert McCammon or Brian Keene or Richard Lehman or whoever it is that may go in the bent that they have, you know.
What's the biggest stir a book? I think about movies and blockbusters of people lining up.
I'm
What's
not
the biggest
mentioning
stir?
Twilight in this conversation.
Okay. No, let's forget that. Okay, actually, if that's the answer, then go to the second. But what's the biggest stir and like where the people were most interested in? Oh, we have to come get this book, and there was actually an anticipation for a book in the 20 years. Was there ever a period where there was that kind of attention for a new horror? Whether there was a new Stephen King book? It's something I don't.
King and Barker
knew
do
anything
that kind of
yeah.
thing. And for a while, the Dexter books were doing that because the series was doing so well. Right now, the stuff that's selling the best for me are children's books. I don't mean young adult. I mean children's. Like My Brother is a Monster, and it's a picture book.
I bought one from there.
Yeah, I've got...
you have a good section there. That's why you've...
Good Night Goon.
Good Night Goon, I've got, That's no, but you've
what she
tailored
says to
it.
her husband and I. Good Night Goon. It's,
Hook them while they're young. You're like McDonald's.
That's it.
Get those kids into horror while
And
they're...
then make the seats uncomfortable so they don't stay long.
Exactly. No, but it works because Marnie comes into the store and she immediately knows where the kids' room is, and so she'll take off running to the kids' room.
Yeah.
So you've done well.
And in the adults, it's nonfiction that sells the best right now. You know, books on, like we were talking about. Oh, no, I used to have true crime. I don't have much anymore. Now I kind of keep it to The Ripper or that kind of thing. True crime in general just didn't move for me. That's part of that changing as you go along. I got rid completely of my young adult section. And it's not because young adult doesn't sell. It's the number one selling of all book categories. But they don't come to a horror store to buy young adult. Because most young adult is fantasy, like Hunger Games or Harry Potter or, you know, that kind of... It's not horror. There's very little young adult horror.
I'll be curious to see if the Goosebumps movie kind of gives a resurgence to Goosebumps books again. That'd be cool if they had a little... I could see somebody rebooting those books and giving a new spin, you know?
Right. Well, if there's one book that people ask for over and over and over and over, it's Elvin Schwartz's book.
Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark.
Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, which was a great book. 3 books.
3 books. I have all 3.
And then they put out an omnibus. And then when they put it back out, they changed the artist.
Which is like death. Because that art, like I've questioned getting that art tattooed on my body. That's how much those stories meant to me.
And people were freaked out by that art, and they want to see it again. And now they've kind of Disneyed it up a little bit and made it much more palatable.
I wonder if they couldn't afford the artist anymore.
It could be, but I mean, you just use that same art because that art, and it was so gruesome and it was so gory and it was grisly and grimy and gooey.
And it was just black and white.
And it was just black and white.
Oh, I gotta look this up.
Here, I'll pull it up on my computer for you right now. Once you see the art, you'll recognize it because it was my desktop background for years. But yeah, those books, like when Rob said things that affected us as kids, I checked those out of my elementary school library in repetition, and I remember us fighting over who got to check them out each week. And finally, my teacher got copies and kept them in the classroom, and I remember for my birthday, my mom got me book 1 and book 2. And then book 3 didn't come out until a couple of years later, but I got that one as soon as it came out.
What was the most returned or like a book that upset people? Like, obviously, at the top, very high on my list of books that influenced me in life was when kind of before I'd even heard of American Psycho. I was in an Australian bookstore. I saw it, and all I saw was the cover saying you cannot buy this book. I don't know if that was the case here, but in Australia, it had an age that you had to be. First time I'd ever seen this in a book. So it was like going into a video store, had a wrapper, and it said 18 plus. I bought this book. I didn't know who the guy was, knew nothing about it, so I didn't get any of the controversy. And I'm reading this thing going, and I'd read a lot of true crime, and I just was like, like couldn't believe the descriptions I was reading because it's nothing like the movie. I mean,
right.
you know, starving rats to put inside a woman, and you know, this kind of stuff that was just really. And the line between fantasy and satire was less apparent to me in the book than it is in the movie, where she's making kind of a comedy with the movie. Right. But in this, it's like really unnerving. So I wondered, like, if has there been books like that where people have come back and kind of maybe even been mad at you for the book?
No, I've been pretty lucky there.
Okay, probably because people have seen it. So
but Rebekah and I were talking earlier about, can horror be too extreme in literature or on film? And I'm working on something about that right now, and the answers from the readers versus from the writers are a little bit different too. But there's some readers that say, you can throw anything you want at me. And Rebekah, you said that you can take stuff that's much more in your face on the page than you can on the screen.
Yeah, if it tends to be more extreme on the page, I will consider it to be a great book, recommend it to people, and read it more than once. If it's more extreme on the screen, I treat it like Serbian film, where I'm like, okay, I made it through that. That wasn't great.
Yeah, we were joking, like, Serbian film, the book. That would have been an intense read.
But I talk about things like Blood Meridian, where like Blood Meridian, I'm like, yes, it's a great book. I've read it multiple times. It's very extreme. I don't recommend it to everyone. It's very intense. It's really racist too. But you know, if that was actually made into a movie, I'm not sure I would enjoy it as much as I do the book.
Or they wouldn't be able to.
Or they wouldn't be able to
get
like,
to that
push
same
it
thing.
as far as
I
it
think
goes.
they could if we had Peck and Paul still around.
Well, the person who owned the
Yeah.
rights for years was Ridley Scott was obsessed by it. He wanted to make it for like 10 years, and I think he might even still own it. And he just probably couldn't crack the dialogue.
It's in my top 5 horror books, and of course, it's a Western as opposed to, it's more like a Treasure of the Sierra Madre kind of book. But
I've always wanted to read it. I've had it on my
extreme.
shelf for a long time. I should read
Interesting
it.
thing. It's based off this true life, like autobiographical book called Confessions of a Rogue, which was this guy's like diary that he wrote as he did just this horrible, fucked up shit throughout the West. And it's incredibly hard to find, but they have a copy of it at the Burbank Library. And I read it. And he is just a total douchebag, just doing these horrible things throughout the West and talking about how fantastic he is the entire time. But you read that and then you're like, oh, I get Blood Meridian.
Actually,
now.
a good example of what you were just talking about, the page and the screen, is Cormac McCarthy's The Road. On the book is so effective and harrowing, and the movie is so just bleak. Like, it's not actually that scary. It's not a bad, I really think the director's a great director. It's just too bleak to like even really get through it. Whereas the book, which is equally bleak, somehow I just get it. I get what that book was trying to express, and it's disturbing.
Oh, I agree.
But
because
it's a great book.
Every Christmas, my wife and I and my 2 stepsons, we get together for a Christmas movie, and then we go to an afternoon dinner. And one year it was The Road that got picked. And it's not a Christmas movie.
No.
It's the pre-Walking Dead, right? I think it was right before, but it's that tone. It looks almost the same, the
Very
worlds.
much, yeah.
But it's a good movie, and like the movie he made before The Proposition's great. But yeah, that book, it's scary. It's a scary book. It's like they're vampires. That's how it feels. Yeah, interesting.
Before, I wanted to talk about our favorite books at some point, but before that, just as a writer, I wanted to talk a little bit about your actual writing, because having to run and maintain a bookstore for 21 years, which takes up a lot of your time. It's a full-time business and job. How much does that affect, or if at all, where do you find the balance to do some of your own writing when it comes to running a store and constantly keeping on top of authors and things you like, just because it's part of the business? But when do you make the time for your own writing?
And that's truly what you do. You make the time.
Okay.
I mean, yeah, you have to. As my wife says with a cheery face, oh, yeah, 24/7. We live and work together.
Yeah.
But my laptop is on the dining room table, and the TV is across the room from me, and the couch where she's sitting watching the TV. And sometimes I'll comment, and sometimes I won't. And I don't wear headphones or anything, but I've learned how to zone. And then other times I'll wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning and can't get the thought out of my head. And I'm not someone who writes down on a pad of paper next to the bed. I'll get up, I'll type the thought down, and once it's out of my head and onto the computer, it's gone. I can then go to bed and go to sleep.
Right.
So a lot of times I'll be online between like 3 and 5 in the morning because I was up typing.
Yeah.
I just thought you were a creepy Facebook friend. Yeah, I'm just like, oh, he's still up.
What's still doing
at 3 a.m.?
Dell is stalking somebody.
4 a.m.
Yeah.
That's funny.
When's the first book that you wrote and got out into the world? What was that whole process like?
Well, I got in the way I think a lot of people who write that book and then they can't get a publisher and so they self-publish should be doing it. Mm-hmm. And that is short stories. Get into somebody else's book. Get into Eric Miller's 18 Wheels of Horror or whatever it is. Mm-hmm. And as I've always said, if you want to build cars, you move to Detroit. Well, you did in the old days. But, if you want to write books, you have to hang out with authors or editors or publishers. So there is Horror Writers Association, and there is a World Horror Convention, and there's a World Fantasy Convention that happens once a year. They constantly change location, parts of the country, even out of country. And go spend the weekend with people who do what you do and want to do. And you start doing that networking thing. You can't do it online from the beginning. You have to do FaceTime, because if I've got an anthology going, like the last anthology was the Midian Unmade anthology I did with Jonas Cease and Clive. And we always ask certain people in that we think would fit it, that are people we want to write a story. And then we always leave spaces, at least I always in my anthology, leave spaces to be surprised. Mm-hmm. Mid-list writers, people, I have somebody in there who's never been published before. Mm-hmm. But after we got in the people who we had asked for, and they agreed, we had like 6 or 7 spots, something like that, open. And we put out an open call for it. And it all had to be done in the world of Clive Barker's Nightbreed.
Right.
And between Joe and I, we read over 1,000 short stories for the book for 7.
Wow.
But if it comes down to it, and say Rebekah's got a story that I think's pretty good, and somebody else has one, and they're pretty much equal, and I know Rebekah, and I've never heard of this other person. Who am I going to put in my anthology?
Me.
Yeah, see? But that's why you need FaceTime. That's why you need to have time. And I think that goes in the film business.
Yeah.
And
it does.
in
that's the
journalism
unspoken thing about living in LA. A lot of people have lived here maybe against their will. They don't even want to be here.
Right.
But that's the powerful thing, is like the relationships can't be faked.
I don't think it's unspoken, because the very first thing I ever heard from the moment I got in the entertainment industry is it's all about who you know.
Yeah,
and it is.
Yeah,
every job I've gotten, every promotion, every freelance gig, on this podcast, it's all about who you know.
Exactly. Yeah. And the nice thing with the horror convention, and World Horror Convention isn't a fan convention. It's not a bunch of people walking around with a knife stuck in their head. It's editors, writers, and publishers and panels, and then a lot of business goes on in the hotel lobby bar. And that's where you need to spend your time. So you don't have to live in LA. You can be from Podunk, Iowa, or East Jesus, Mississippi. But
I'm moving there. East Jesus, Mississippi.
But it makes sense, because I always tell writers when they're like, how do I network? I always say, don't go to fan conventions. You're just going to meet a bunch of fans. If you want to network, you go to film festivals, because that's where you're going to meet filmmakers and people who are actually doing this in the industry. It's like a completely different thing. And same thing. If you go to a film festival and you want to meet people, where do you do that? You hang out in the bar.
Exactly.
But I think the key to what Dell's saying also in terms of FaceTime is, don't approach people like I don't know how to word this. Don't come off too strong about what you want. You know what I mean? That because that's the thing. It's like people approach you and they tell you what they want from you, as opposed to just having a genuine conversation. I mean, the best example I could give, and we should give him a name drop, is Aaron Dries, an author that was on our 100th episode. And I have your books. I haven't read them yet, Aaron. I'm sorry. But no, I mean, Aaron approached us at the Texas convention just as a listener of the show. And
at Jump Cut first.
Oh, at Jump Cut. He's giving a Jump Cut to you.
He came all the way to go there, he said.
Yeah, he came all the way and went to Jump Cut. And then we just talked to him. And I don't even think the words "I am an author" came up at least till 12 hours after we met him. He was just a genuine person that was very sharp and smart and intelligent and really into this stuff. And that's what I like, is I like being around, other creative people.
I want to be around the person first.
Yeah.
And then the writer later.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Well,
as a
exactly.
filmmaker.
You can liken it to somebody writing to you who's never written you a message before on Facebook, but they send you a Kickstarter and say, hey, I think you're going to really like my Kickstarter. And they're like, I don't even know you. You know what I mean? And it's a very similar thing. People, it's like trying to take before you have given.
Yeah.
So-and-so has asked Dark Delicacies to like their page.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. But the nice thing about the conventions is that when you sign up for them, they usually have pitch meetings for anybody who wants to do that.
Cool.
And you sign up until they run out of space, and you get like 10 minutes with an editor, and you can bring them your manuscript, you can bring them your idea, you bring them, but it's also good training in pitch meeting.
Yeah.
But going back to your original question, so my first sale was a short story, which was in Jeff Gelb's book, Hot Blood. He did an entire series of Hot Blood anthologies, and they were erotic horror. And then that story was bought by Lionsgate, and they had done, Mick Garris had done Masters of Horror, and then Lionsgate did Fear Itself, which was the spin-off from it for NBC. And they bought my story, and Mick scripted it, and it became the premiere episode of Fear Itself.
Done with Eric Roberts?
The one,
It was the three
Western.
gals, the Western kind, and in fact, it was a Western, and they did it as Gunrunners, whatever.
What's it called?
Who directed that one?
Bones
Something, and the only thing they kept of mine
Fessenden.
really was
No,
the
Fessenden
characters'
did
names
that.
and that there were women in a fort.
Your name's still on it, though, because
Yeah.
I remember that part.
Yeah, my name's still in the credits based on a story by. So then when I decided to do my anthologies, the Dark Delicacies ones, I called on Jeff, and he co-edited them all with me because I didn't know diddly squat about editing an anthology at that time. So I learned by working side by side with him. But my entrance was a short story. And there's always anthologies looking for short stories, looking for submissions. And groups like the Horror Writers Association, when you're a member, you can go to a page and they have, oh, so-and-so's looking for this, and here's the requirements, and here's the deadline, and blah, blah, blah.
Yeah. Wow.
I'm curious, what was the last time when you read something, because we read so much, we see so many movies, it takes a lot for me to be floored. It still happens almost once a year, to be honest, where I'm floored by a work of art or a film. Do you remember the last time? It follows. I wasn't quite floored. I like Under the Skin. No, Under the Skin is truly the last thing that floored me, where I just couldn't even believe what I was watching in a sense. But you know what I mean? Do you remember the last novelist or the last book you read where you felt that way? Like, wow, this is really connected, even if it's years ago? I'm curious.
Probably, if I was going to say, it's like my top 5 horror novels at this point. So it would be things like Robert McCammon's Boy's Life.
Don't know.
Dan Simmons' Summer of Night.
I'll have to write these down.
Thomas Tryon, any one of his 3 are great. The Other, Harvest Home, or Lady.
I've heard
pick
the
any
Other
of them
was good.
you want.
Now, are these recent ones mostly?
No, they're probably the newest one is probably a decade. Probably like the early 2000s.
So in the last couple of years, though, is there less stuff that you're kind of being blown away by, like really recently, or do you think it's just you can't get around to reading everything?
I don't read as much.
Yeah.
For one thing, because with my writing and with running the store, I just don't have the time to read. In fact, I told Rebekah earlier I'm currently reading Chrissie Hynde's autobiography right now. So, I'm steeped in horror all the time. So I have a huge blues collection of books. I'm a big blues fan.
Yeah.
So I have a bookcase of that, and I read a lot of
you need a
musician
break.
books.
Clean the palate.
And here's a weird one. I'm working my way. I'm 3/4 of the way through all of the Longmire books of the Longmire series.
Yeah.
So anything that's different is kind of good for me.
Yeah.
You know,
I love those. My non-horror one that I'm just addicted to is the Joe Nesbo crime fiction. Harry Hole is the character, and they're as good as any James Patterson serial killer thing. But there's something about
Swedish?
the setting. Yeah, they're Swedish.
Yeah.
When they finally make these into movies, they're going to be knockouts because the character is really good, but the settings are really just grim. And but it's funny what will pull you in to keep reading them. Like it's different from a great literature, right? You read one great book, but when you get one of those series that hooks you, it's a very different thing that they're going. It's much more like TV versus a great movie.
Well, it was funny. I read the Sue Grafton series. A is for alibi, B is for burglary.
Oh my God, my mom eats those things. Like she'll finish them in a weekend.
Yeah.
And
I mean, it's basically
them.
the same story over, for the most part. But what was great about them, it was like putting on your favorite pair of jeans.
Yeah.
You knew what to expect. It felt good. You knew where you were going. The characters lived next door. You didn't have to think. You kind of just blew everything off for a while reading the story. And sometimes that's what I want. It's like the difference between a heavy film and a popcorn movie.
Yeah, you need it all. Yeah. We want it all.
Yeah.
I totally get it.
It's the reason that, and I've told them this before and they laugh at me, that I love like the Da Vinci Code movies or the National Treasure movies. I know exactly what to expect. There's going to be twists, and
she just rewatched it with It Follows. So.
But I know exactly how it's going to play out. I know exactly what Nicolas Cage's reaction is going to be.
You can never predict a Nicolas Cage reaction. You're insane. That's an impossible thing.
You can in those
Maybe
movies.
in a Disney movie you can.
You touched upon it before, but I want to get the full scoop on it because I think it's such a cool thing. Is the story behind Midian Unmade. Because these are a series of short stories based on Nightbreed, and
Cabal.
And the fact that Clive would do this is awesome. That he would say other people write about my stuff, but I guess he did that in the '90s with the Hellraiser comics. But I love the idea that he will set up the mythos and then
there was a Hellraiser anthology.
Not too long ago.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
One of the things. Well, the idea for the anthology came from Joe Nassis, the other editor.
Okay.
And he had never done an anthology, so he came to me somewhat like I did with Jeff. So it was kind of cool. Plus, I was friends with Clive, so we had that connection. It was his idea, so we did it. And Clive has written stories for my Dark Delecacies anthologies. Mm-hmm. So Clive said, sure. And one of the things I didn't want, and I didn't want all the stories to be the same. Mm-hmm. And so Clive said to us right off, he said, Midian is a city. It was an underground city. I could only write about certain denizens of that city. But it's a democracy of monsters. So feel free to create monsters, too. Mm-hmm. So it was very important for us to at least have a story about each of the characters everybody knew, Pelican, whomever. But we also wanted stories that nobody knew. We showing you some other monsters from Midian. And if you remember Nightbreed or Cabal, at the end of that story, because they live under the cemetery in Midian, it's destroyed and they're scattered out to the world. They're a tribe called the Breed, they refer to themselves. So the idea behind it is that they're trying to unite at this point, and here's the individual tale of each one who's out there. Joe and I talked about wanting, if you were unfamiliar with Nightbreed or Cabal entirely, to be able to pick it up and read it like a good horror anthology. Yeah. Not need a whole novel of background to.
Yeah.
So we had some parameters like that we were.
Did anyone write about? Because I remember that's still pretty much my most disappointing moment of childhood, which means I didn't have too bad a childhood. Was finishing Nightbreed and realizing there was never going to be a sequel. Because I just remember going, oh cool, I can't wait for next year, and it never came. But the preacher who gets kind of reanimated at the end. Did anyone do that story of that?
Yes, people did.
I'd love to read that because that's a movie I want to watch. I wanted to see what he would be like when he came back.
See, I always wanted to know about the other monsters. Like, how did they get set up?
Right, and there's a lot of that. This is basically a sequel, but told in individual
parts.
vignettes.
Yeah, that's cool.
So another thing which was unfortunate but needed, like if you wrote a story about one of the main characters, and I talked to Joe, and Joe and I loved it, and we took it. If you wrote a story featuring the same character, you were automatically out because I don't want 5 stories about Babette.
Right.
I need a Babette story. So some of it was waiting till the last minute to pick the best Babette or whatever, and then still making sure we were getting the stories in. So there was a lot we were playing with, and it's really a very small area. Writers who know the mythology enough to be able to go in there and write about it.
How many sexy porcupine wait, what's her name? Peliquin? How many sexy porcupine lady stories did you get?
We got a ton of those.
I bet.
But we hope
sexy
that we
lady.
pulled the best one. And there were times when we were getting near the end. Okay, that's it. Send a contract out, and then another story comes in with that character that you go, fuck.
Wait, you said fuck the law.
That's right.
Fuck the law. I always love that delivery.
So it's there. I mean, and I didn't want. One of the things I noticed on the Hellraiser anthology, which I thought was great, I had a good time with that. But he was even a smaller world, so almost all the stories were wrapped around somebody finds a box or the puzzle box or the whatever, and we wanted to make them as diverse as we could. So there were challenges with this one. It was a lot of fun to work with, and Clive gave us complete freedom. So that was
Does
really
Clive end
nice.
up reading these things, or would that be too close to home for him?
He did, yeah. He didn't read them in us choosing.
Yeah.
He gave us complete freedom in the
But
choosing.
then he read the final.
And then he read the uncorrected proof. And
It must be kind of a magical moment to see your world filtered through all these different people's imagination.
it was, and I'm sure it was, an eye-opening experience. The reviews have been terrific for it. My favorite review, though, was an Amazon review where the person said, 1 star, this book sucks. If I'd known that Clive Barker hadn't written any of these stories, I wouldn't have bought it.
Clive probably has that one on his wall.
And there's like 10 responses. Read the cover.
That's funny.
Man, what are you going to do? Idiots. Anyway.
So you guys have favorite horror?
Well,
Me too.
Yeah, I just thought, I thought before.
I don't know if I made a clean 5 though. I find it's a lot harder than writing movies.
Did you leave out 6? Because I've never.
No, I just have there's just like 12 titles I just throw down because they're things that interest me.
Really? Because I did, even just since you guys mentioned at the top of the show, I did 5 fiction and 5 nonfiction.
Oh, God.
I mean, I have a lot of list books that had a big influence on me, but we can talk about that afterwards.
Let's go in order. Let's do narrative first.
Sure. Yeah.
I threw 5 down, and honestly, it's been so long since I've read any of these books, with the exception of one that I assume they're still my favorites.
Are you going to revisit any of them like your films?
I would love to actually. Because for me, I've said it before in the show, I'm a slow reader, so it takes me a while. But also, sometimes I like to scatter and read 3 books. So I'll read a bio book and then a making of a movie book and then a narrative novel, just because I like keeping, just keeping things a little bit different. So
I'm almost always reading 3 books at the same time. So I'll read a nonfiction, a fiction novel, and a short story book, because the short story one, I read the entire story in one sitting. So there's no character mix up.
Exactly. Yeah. I'll just shoot my 5 favorite books off. When it comes to Stephen King, it's The Dead Zone, which is also my favorite movie, and it's my favorite Cronenberg, my favorite Christopher Walken. I think it's because of the whole, I made that whole like superhero analogy, how I feel the movie is the perfect 3-act structure of a superhero tale. It's, the superpower, he gets the power, then there's his origin, and then he's out in the world and facing his destiny. And I always like that theme, both in the movie and the book. Other than that, I also love a book by Patrick Siskind called Perfume, the story of a murderer.
I love that.
That was a movie
too.
that couldn't be made correctly
I
if you read the
movie.
book. But the book is so much richer.
It's because you can't read your olfactory organ.
We needed smellorama.
It really is difficult. That's hard.
I did think they made a good movie out of it, but
Good-ish.
It would have been a really difficult.
Yeah, the book is like its own world. It really is one of the best written books I've ever read. It's just like the language that you just can feel it. You can feel the book. It's an alive thing.
Robert Bloch, who wrote Psycho, of course. I could be obvious and say Psycho, but I don't remember much about this book other than I read it really, really fast because I was really into it. And it even has a quote on the front from Stephen King saying, "I devoured it in one sitting." And it's his book, Laurie. And I just remember reading it. And, because a lot of Robert Bloch stuff is he was really good at kind of sleight of hand, the setting up what you think the story is about, and then no, wait, it's this. So I remember that one being very surprising, and the entire time trying to imagine a movie version and wondering why there wasn't a movie version. And again, I don't remember the book too well, but I think there's some complicated stuff towards the end. It's like, oh yeah, this would be impossible to make into a movie.
Or maybe there's a movie with a name change. No.
I don't know. I'd have to look into that. Yeah, but it was one of the few Bloch titles that I didn't think got adapted, but I could be wrong. So there's that. That's number 3. Bob Randell wrote a book, The Fan, which I think is from the 70s, if I'm not mistaken. They did make a movie of it with. It's one of the first things that Michael Biehn ever did, and who is it? Lauren Bacall, maybe.
Yeah.
But the movie is pretty awful. The book is one of the most riveting books I've ever read, and I want to say Michael Gingle from Fangoria is the person that actually recommended it to me.
Really?
And I've since bought it for people. I remember I bought it for Darren Bousman recently because he was thinking of doing something in that vein, and I just thought this will inspire you. And what I love about it is it's essentially a stalker story. It's, the main character is a very famous actress that's now doing a play, and the entire book, every page is just letters. So it starts out as a letter from her ex-husband, like wishing her well in the new show, letter from her agent, and then you get a letter from the fan. And it starts out kind of like, I'm your biggest fan, like very charming and all that. And as the correspondence go by, the whole book is just correspondence via letter. As the fans' letters get more into it, they start to get really dark and kind of fucked up and threatening. And it's just one of those books, like that's one you could probably read in one sitting as well. And it's weird because, for the time period, I thought it was brilliant, but it's like, we're so used to communication that way. We could read, emails and texts and things like that, and the way that people communicate. We're addicted to, Facebook. We watch we see the comments and the way people react. And that book has that feeling where you're getting the look behind people's correspondence with each other and actually getting a great story out of it. So when I read it, I was like, you can't make this into a movie. It'd be impossible. But they tried and they kind of failed.
It was impossible.
Yes, it was impossible. And lastly, kind of a tie, I guess, because I put down Thomas Harris and Red Dragon. I haven't read it since I was, probably in my early 20s. But having revisited the story through the show, I just remember how much of an impact that book had on me. And I like Silence Lines. I like Hannibal. I liked all the other books, but that one in particular, I remember being really, really special. And in the same token, a guy named Tom Savage wrote the book Valentine, which, yes, was in name adapted into the 90s slasher movie, but they only share the name Valentine in common, and that there's a murder in both. The book is excellent. Like a really, really great little murder mystery that, again, you read and you're like, once they reveal certain plot twists and stuff, you're like, oh, you can't get away with that in a movie because you'd see the person the whole time. And you know what I mean? So I thought that was a really good one too. But yeah, those are mine.
Bekah, you just mentioned a David Boreanaz film. How do you feel? Boreanaz boner?
No, anything.
It's subsided? What's that in your stomach?
David Boreanaz, baby.
Narrative stuff. What do you got?
Yeah, narrative stuff. My favorite book, horror book of all time. It's also the one whenever I get asked if I could make one book into a movie, it's always my answer. We've Always Lived in the Castle by Shirley Jackson. Same person who wrote like The Lottery and House on Haunted Hill. Oh, yeah. And it's just this really kind of classic fairy tale gothic fucked up story about two teen sisters who live in this family castle and what happened to their family and the story behind them and everything. And I love that book so much. I started reading it when I was a kid, and it's just kind of stuck with me. And it's also some of my favorite cover art, and it was stolen by Bava for Shock.
For Shock, yeah.
Yeah. But it was originally on Shirley Jackson's We've Always Lived in the Castle. So I absolutely love that one. Bradbury, and I couldn't even tell you which one it was, but when I was a kid, my parents had this collection of Bradbury short stories, and I read it repeatedly. And he had so many, and the stories got rearranged a lot of the time, but I remember it had the blue bottle in it, was one of the ones in it, because I really liked that story, and it just wonderful stuff. And my mom was a big sci-fi buff. So we had Asimov and all of his stuff, and we had Bradbury and Philip K. Dick, and we just had this glut of sci-fi novels always on the shelf. And though I didn't like a lot of the sci-fi stuff, because if it got into like robotics or anything like that, it just kind of bored me, I loved the covers of them so much. Like she has all of the early Philip K. Dick novels with the original like 1970s covers. Those things were so badass. Yeah. And I still have her copy of like The Man Whose Teeth Were All the Same Size. Not a great novel, but the cover art's killer and things like that. And even the Bradbury one that I read so many times, I remember that it was a woman in a nightgown who turned into a rocket. She like metamorphosed into a rocket on the cover. And this is like the early 70s one. So that's number 2 would be Bradbury short stories. Number 3, any Killer Crab books by Guy Smith.
Guy and Smith.
Oh my God, yeah. And this also started when I was a kid. I read one of his Killer Crab books when I was really young, and those they're like...
Killer Crab is in plural? Like there's multiple Killer Crab books?
There's like at least, I would say 12, probably more.
And Jesus Gonzalez and Mark Williams were such big fans of it. They wrote 2 Killer Crab, Giant Attack of the Killer Crab books.
This is a whole thing, Rob. Catch up with Killer Crabs. So no, I started...
Wow.
Night of the Crabs was actually the first one, or it may have been Origin of the Crabs.
Bad date movie. Night of the Crabs.
But it was one of these, and I vividly remember that we had this bookshop, this used bookshop in my hometown called the Bookshelf, and I used to go there all the time after school because it was the 90s, and everything I wore had to come from a vintage shop because that's how you dressed. And so I was there like looking for floral 70s dresses to put under my cardigan that I would use to cover up my hands and, look very grungy. And I would always go into the bookshelf afterwards, and I found a used copy of a Guy Smith Crab book when I was in high school, and I read the thing in like 2 days, and I just loved them. And the dialogue is awful. They're not well written. The crabs kick ass. But it's very much like you mentioned with like the Sue, I can't even remember her name, like the A is for blank novels.
Right, the Grafton book.
Yeah, the Sue Grafton books, or even like the V.C. Andrews ones, where they're pretty much all the same, but you know what you're going to get, and it's like your favorite pair of jeans. So that's my number 3. Number 4, I just recently got into it, I have to say, the Meg series. I really enjoyed those. And again, it's like, you know what you're going to get. They're not exactly, I mean, you're not reading like Hamlet or, it's not Stephen King exactly, but they're fun. And I guess that's what I look for when I'm reading late at night is
fun.
Because when I read, I mean, it's at the end of like an enormously long day, and usually it's like midnight and I'm barely awake. And I need something that's going to make me not fall asleep while reading it, so I don't read the same paragraph 4 times in a row and then find myself sleeping with the book open, which I do all the time. But at least with Meg, I'll like press through a chapter and I'm conscious through the whole thing because I'm fascinated by what
reading
it is.
Like House of Leaves when you're falling asleep is not a good...
I've tried so many books like that. Like,
I've always wanted to get through that book. It looks so cool. House of Leaves. It just looks cool.
And even like I tried to read Ghost Story before I fell asleep last year, and it's such a great story, but it's a little long-winded in parts, and my head's bobbing, and I read the same sentence 5 times, and then I'm like, it's futile. I can't do anything at this point. And then the last one would be Chuck Palahniuk's Haunted.
I really want to read that now after seeing it on so many lists. When I was looking up books, they made so many of these lists. I've never read that one.
I remember I just moved to New York City, and the first place I went in New York City was I had heard so much about the Strand, and so I immediately went to the Strand, and they had this giant end cap of it. And I was like, Chuck Palahniuk did a horror story. I have to have this. And I mean, Lullaby kind of was, or Palahniuk. I'm saying it wrong. Palahniuk. It was
Dennis Whitmire.
Dennis Whitmire told me, he said it's 2 words, Paula and neck. So it's Palahniuk.
Yeah.
So Chuck Palahniuk, there was like a giant end cap, and I was like, oh my God, he did just a book of horror stories. And the first one in it is this pool. It's set in a pool. That's all I can say. It's like the most fucked up story I've ever read in my life. And,
I think that's next on my list. I really think that'll be my next read.
Dark Delicacies, he wrote one for us.
Really?
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
Wow. It is.
It was about a ball.
we'll just stop there.
Yeah.
It's going to be messed up, whatever it is. But yeah, every single story in the Haunted book, I was just floored by. I couldn't read them back to back because it took me so long to go, I can't believe I just read that. And then I'd have to recover, and then I'd read the next one the next day. But yeah, I know a number of people were like scrambling to get rights to it, to make a movie version of it. And I don't even know what happened.
Of one of the stories?
Of all of them, to do like an anthology of them.
Oh, that'd be fucked up.
Yeah.
That's going to go on the cover. Your
It'd
quote.
be fucked up. But yeah, because I mean, there's some fucked up shit in there. But I don't even know what happened to it. But I know that right after the book came out, there was like this scramble, and you would see like in Variety, like so-and-so applies for Haunted rights. No, so-and-so else buys it. And then nothing ever happened. So, but it would be amazing. Yeah. So I did definitely go through a phase where I read a crazy amount of Lovecraft and didn't understand most of it.
Yeah, I mean, I don't recall reading novels, just stories. Same with Poe. I mean, Poe, some novels, but mostly it's like the stories and images you remember. And I didn't include them. I'll fly through mine a little bit, because it could easily be the Damnation Game and then all of Stephen King, for me. Because so with Stephen King, I was trying to remember. It was hard for me to remember which ones. I mean, I know for a fact that The Mist was my favorite story that I came across, even though it's not a book.
Just picked up as a TV show today.
But The Mist, the story versus the movie, and the movie has all sorts of great things about it too. But The Mist, the story just got my brain in some. I think it was actually one of those stories that was responsible for wanting to make movies, because I wanted to make that movie in my head. Like and so when I first saw the movie, I was really not into it, because the movie I wanted in my head was very different, And but I loved it, and weirdly enough, I actually, when I watched Messiah of Evil again recently, I thought there was more of that to do with the story. Something about they're in the shop, because they're stuck in that kind of space. Anyway, that was the story. But so if I had to pick though as Stephen King, I think I was going to pick it, because it was the one I had to build up to, because it was such a big book. Yeah. Like I was used to reading these smaller, but when it came out, it was just so big, and I felt like a real accomplishment having read it, and I thought it was scary. So I would put it. Damnation Game is definitely the key one for me. It was I just remember it so well. I'm sure I still have this copy somewhere, but it was the one where I guess my tastes were becoming more adult, with that book. My favorite book of the last few years, even though it's older, that I've come across was because John Skipp came on, and McGarris came on This Week in Horror, the one with Stacey was hosting way back when, and we did an episode where we asked them to recommend fiction to us that they liked, and they laid out all these books, and some were like graphic novels that I picked up. But the one book that I picked up that had a really great effect on me, and I've been thinking about it a lot lately, is The Cipher by Kathy Koja, and it's kind of splatterpunk set in New York City, or is it Detroit? I can't remember. It might be Michigan.
She's from Detroit.
Yeah,
so
she's from
sense.
Yeah, exactly. And it's set in a video store, and these kind of punks. A guy really likes the girl. They basically go back to his apartment. They find this kind of hole, and it kind of like when The Hole came out by Joe Dante. I was like, oh, I wonder if this will be something to Koja, and then it's a kid's thing. This is not. They basically find that this hole is basically, it's like a void perhaps to hell or something worse, and you put your arm in and you can almost transmutate your arm. They put a video camera in, old school video camera, big VHS cassettes, and they film a little bit, and then they come in, and basically anyone who watches this VHS tape becomes like mesmerized, and all they want to do is keep watching it, because there's weird little particles and things and skulls and things. Did you see that? And you're not sure if you saw it. And the whole thing doesn't build in any like traditional, like I could even articulate it in a soundbite. It's a whole lot of occurrences that I found just really unnerving and interesting, and for a long time, it's just one of those stories that I feel like it feels very contemporary the way she writes, even though it's set probably mid 80s, maybe early 90s. It's a great little book.
It was, if not the first, it was one of the first books in the special Del Abyss line that they came out with. And that ran about 2 years, where every month a new horror book came out under that line. Introduced us to a lot of great writers, and then I guess wasn't making enough money, and
right. I need to read the one Skip and Craig Spector wrote. What is that? The Light at the End of the...
Light at the End.
Because I saw that make a lot of lists like that. It was number one on a lot of lists. I've just never read it, so I should probably check it out. Then I would probably... Let me jump... Well, see, I'd put American Psycho / Lunar Park together, because they're American Psycho, when I read it, just had a big effect of like shaking me up, I guess. And then years later, he came out with another book called Lunar Park, which was basically more or less Bret Easton Ellis kind of as the American Psycho, as a guy almost stalking Bret Easton Ellis, and it bifurcates like the character and the narrative and the author, and it's quite scary. It's kind of a I think it's actually scarier as a read than American Psycho is much more about shaking us up and disturbing us. Lunar Park is actually really I think it's kind of a disturbing and scary read from my memory. I read it a few years back.
Right.
Perfume, those kind of three are all kind of because they're similar. They're similar kind of vibes. And then I'll just throw out a couple titles because I can't really. There's one other book that no one in America, I've never even heard of this writer mentioned here. He's been one of my favorite writers for the last 10 years. I'm a huge Ian McEwan fan, and after reading all his stuff, like especially his early stuff, Cement Garden, really disturbing stuff, I came across a Scottish writer called John Burnside, and he was a poet, and he wrote his first novel is called The Dumb House, and it's really dark and disturbing. They probably wouldn't be put in the horror section, but they all go so dark that they are. And then he made one called The Locust Room, which was literally about a serial killer. And I would tell people to check this writer up or just look him up. But The Dumb House, the first one he wrote, for the longest time, was obsessed that it should be a movie, but it wouldn't do any business. I think it was about some guy who was doing, he basically wanted to discover the language of God. So he would take twins just as they were born, and then he would just put them somewhere where they would never talk to anyone, have any human interaction, except being fed to see what their organic language would, basically become. And I can't even remember all the things that happened, but I remember being so disturbed by the world. It's just a really interesting book, short book. But he's an interesting writer because he was a poet and he won all the main poetry prizes in the UK for years. And then he started writing fiction, and the fiction has that quality.
What's the name of that one?
That one's called The Dumb House.
The Dumb House.
And it's really good. And then there's just a few others. One of my top 5 for sure, 100%. Joe, and we've talked about a lot here. Joe Lansdale's The Drive-In.
Oh, yeah.
I think about that on a regular basis. It's one of the most wild things I've ever read. I struggled to get through the other ones. Like when I got to the second part, I was like, it's okay. The third part, the first one just has this thing. It's like that magic of bizarreness that only that human could have had the mind to come up with that. That's why I've always Coscarelli's the only person who could direct that, because he's equally got that ability.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why I was trying to make it for the longest time. But I would really think that should be on the top of people's list, especially if they like wacky stuff. It's a bizarre book. And then I just wrote a couple that were I wanted to throw out there because they're more like true crime stuff that had a huge impact. Helter Skelter as a read might have had the biggest impact on me because I became obsessed by true crime. Stranger Beside Me, and then recently, which is the Ted Bundy one, Anne Rule wrote. But the last few years, it was Severed. John Gilmore, who's a major LA writer, just been written, because he lived the life here. Severed is the Black Dahlia story, but more or less from her perspective, from the most part, compared to and not even her perspective. It's more like his account of the kind of stories he knew about her, and he's trying to portray her as an actual person. And it's just a book that I think is absolutely fascinating. And then there's some literature books like The Painted Bird by Jerzy Kosinski or Metamorphosis by Kafka. These books that are horror, and they have all these origins of horror in them. The Painted Bird is kind of Polanski, kind of somewhat based on his friend, which was Roman Polanski when he was a little boy, getting away from the Holocaust, all the crazy stuff that was happening. So, that's the kind of stuff that I don't have a clean 5. But
and other authors that people should think about, read some Thomas Ligotti, read some Jack Ketchum.
Oh, Jack Ketchum. Sure. He's intense. I can barely get through.
You're talking about the crab thing, reminded me, read some Rex Miller, like Chainsaw and some of his other stuff. The late Rex Miller is I
took a photo of one. Have you heard of something called Incarnate by Ramsey Campbell?
Ramsey Campbell is great.
I love The Nameless by him, and he's done
The Nameless.
Yeah. And a couple of years ago, this was probably 5 years ago, I taught, and it was through a summer enrichment program back in Virginia. They had me teach a horror history. It was like history of the horror genre, like everything, literature and everything, to a group of high schoolers over the summer. And to try to connect with them, I started by reading, in my prep, I read all of this young adult horror. And even while we were just talking, I just remembered I read such amazing stuff in the young adult field of horror, far better than most of the stuff I've read in the adult realm. And 4 of them that I remembered while we were sitting here that were just amazing. Forest of Hands and Teeth. And these are all for 10 to 16-year-old kids. The Replacement, which I can't believe hasn't been made into a movie, Anna Dressed in Blood, and Coldest Girl in Cold Town.
I like those titles.
I don't know if you've read any of those, Del.
I have not.
They're amazing. I read probably 10 books in prep for that class, and those were like the 4 that I was like, holy shit, why haven't these been made into movies? So just really good stuff. And
also, John Skip is coming to Dark Delicacies the same day as 18 Wheels of Horror. Oh. John has a new short story book out called The Art of Horrible People.
Oh, I like
which
that.
is in typical Skip, so it's well worth the read.
That sounds like a Skip book.
It does sound great. Del, do you have any personal favorites that either we haven't mentioned or that you haven't, I don't know, just a few books that change your perception of what can be done in horror?
That's always fun. No, that is always fun because you read something and then suddenly you go, you can write that?
Yeah.
And it's you do that with films too. You go,
sure.
You can shoot that? Things that I think it was a Bradbury, you talking about Bradbury. I don't remember the name of the story, but it was the one about 2 ladies who live in a small town and there's a serial killer out killing women walking home alone at night and stuff. And every week they go to a movie together. So, and after the movie, they say goodnight and one goes one way and one goes the other. And the way the one goes is always through this park because it's the shortcut to get home. And you go through this whole thing about the leaves on the trees are moving and it's dark and you hear animals and she's sure she's being chased. And by the time she gets to the other side of the park, she is huffing and puffing and makes it up to her porch and puts the key in the door and opens it and shuts it and just leans against her door, like I made it. And I think the last line is, and a voice behind her said, "Hello there." And, you're just like,
playing shredded nerve.
Matheson, we haven't even mentioned Richard Matheson.
We mentioned him a lot in film because we obviously wrote so many great short anthologies and everything.
Yeah. And Shirley is a wonderful choice, too. And who didn't read The Lottery? And as a short story read, the very first time you read that, whose life was not changed in what they read by that short story?
I remember reading that in, elementary school. I swear we read that in, 5th grade.
I don't think I've read it.
Yeah, we were way too young, but...
No, I don't think I've read it, so maybe I need to read it, so my life will be changed.
No spoilers.
Oh, my God. Even before we read it, I remember being maybe in, I don't know, very, very young. And they showed us a movie version. I guess a short. Somebody made a short of it, I guess. But they showed it to us, and it disturbed me so greatly that I'm like, wait a minute, I'm too young for this. And then we read the story, but it is one of the it's life-changing when you, especially as a formative young man, when you hear that story and kind of the punchline of it, you're like, oh my God.
I have to look it up to see it because I might have.
Seeing a short film version of All Summer in a Day in my school, and then we read the book. And the short film, whatever it was 60 minutes, and I think it was actually a made for TV segment or something. But that messed me up. I remember almost crying in class because I was like, oh my God, what is wrong with people? And I still have that reaction as soon as I think about it. I'm like, what is wrong with humanity?
It was Robert Bloch who taught me the twist ending on a short story because he is famous for that. Now, the problem is a lot of people will end up writing stories with a twist ending and they just use it to death.
Right.
But he was a master of that twist ending. And of course, his number one short story is probably Yours Truly, Jack the Ripper, which is his big one. Yeah.
Wow. What about some, a lot of books I read too. I like bio books, stuff. Obviously, you were saying you were reading a bio before.
Chrissy.
And bio, and that can also go with making of films as well, if we want to do that.
Yeah, I mean, I could just fire some off, because that's probably the thing I read the most of, obviously, over the years, is filmmaking, but not just horror. But I'm just going to, and I won't even go into the Psychotronic Film Guide's top of my, Nightmare USA is still my favorite thing. I've never, still haven't gone through the whole book.
That one's pricey.
Yeah, but who cares? It's just one of the best things.
I
would rather own that than a table. If it's a table book, I will take the book over the table, and I'll put things on it. It really is. It's just I go back to to it every couple of years, and I'll find, and I haven't even gone through the whole thing yet. Film as Subversive Art by Amos Vogel is like one of the most influential books I've ever seen, because it led to just discovering just tons of movies I'd never heard of. Midnight Movie by Jay Hoberman, that was about Eraserhead El Topo. It was about the discovery of that kind of wave. Broken Mirror, Broken Minds by Maitland McDonough was about Argento's films. It was probably my favorite book about a director's work that I'd ever read, but especially early discovering Argento, and you just saw this person who was laying all these connections, and it was a great book. Recently, House of Psychotic Woman, I thought was a beautiful book. Eyeball was a magazine. They made a compendium of it, and it's Stephen Thrower, the same writer as Nightmare USA, and it has a lot of the first essays that were ever written on things like Possession, Argento, any of that kind of extreme Euro horror, Bava and stuff like that. So those are ones that for me, like, you know, and there's lots of ones that had film lists, but they all. And sorry, Nightmare Movies by Kim Newman, which is like the text. You know,
right? Nice. What was the one that came out 2 years ago? I'm going to guess, and nonfiction, and it was about the time period when all the young directors were coming up, and the people like
Shock Value.
Was that did
it have a hand on it?
It's the end of Boris Karloff's career and the end of Vincent Price's career and the end. It's like that time period.
No, that's different.
That time period in horror films was ending, and like Peter Bogdanovich was using Boris and Target.
This is
and then it was the beginning of
Carpenter
Carpenter.
Okay, that's Shock Value. It's a great book.
That was a great book.
Oh no, and that's just a great read, even if you weren't a horror person.
To me, that's the important part of a nonfiction book. Is I don't want to be reading it and having to read like a textbook. I want it to read like Shock Value.
That's Jason Zinnemann. He wrote that, and I read that in like a day. It was so compelling the way he kind of connected it all.
And you never think about that era, and yet that's the way it is in literature too, because after Poe came Lovecraft and Ambrose Bierce and all of those people, and then the middle of the 1900s was almost all given over to sci-fi writers and the pulps, and it wasn't until Bloch and them came in the 50s and stuff, and horror started coming back. But we had a whole section of decades where it was sci-fi and not horror. You know?
Interesting,
Definitely. I'll quick fire mine. So Monster Show by David Scal is, I've read that one cover to cover so many times. Like I can recite the chapter titles, like Scar Wars, the 1980s, things like that. Recreational Terror by Isabel Pinheiro was definitely one of the first books I read about horror. This one's a little bit older, but it's great. She's a professor at Hunter College that I ended up teaching for because I kind of like stalked her when I got to New York and was like, I love your book. And then she was like, oh, you actually have read everything. But it's focused on women in horror, and it's one of the first books that really looked at how women watch horror films and is it different from men? How does a woman receive Last House on the Left different from a guy would? And how is that change over time and the psychology behind it? So it's really fascinating. Ghouls, Gimmicks, and Gold, which was Kevin Hefferman, and it focuses on the marketing of horror films 1950s through like late 60s, early 70s. And so it really gets
into the AIP and that kind of,
Yeah, and so it picks up at the start, like the collapse of the studio system, where the rise of the independents, and then it follows through. I'll call it like the birth of, I'll say around like the birth of the postmodern horror. So like Night of the Living Dead definitely kind of changed the face a bit. So it goes through that. Yeah, it's a lot of Corman. Yeah. It's a lot of Corman. So it's just a phenomenal book. Sleazoid Express is kind of my go-to. It's about Grindhouse, specifically everything that played on 42nd Street and Times Square. And it also examines posters, marketing. I love studying film marketing. So
the writer of that
Bill Landis and Clifford, Michelle Clifford.
Michelle Clifford, I see post
Are you
stuff.
Serious?
Yeah, I've seen retweets
Holy
from there.
Shit,
from the
that
Sleazoid
just
Express
made my fucking day.
Yeah.
Like my PhD dissertation is like, I quote her so much.
I just assumed it was you pretending to be her
and
retweeting us. So this is
I'm
good.
kind of thrilled that she listens. So there is actually a new Grindhouse book, because that's definitely like one of my subject areas I'm most fascinated in. There is one called Grindhouse Nostalgia that just came out. I will say it's a little bit academic. It kind of reads textbooky, but it's really fascinating if you're interested in more of the Grindhouse films. And yeah, was there another one? Philosophy of Horror. I'm really into kind of the books. It's Noel Carroll, who is like a very traditional like film critic, very I write film criticism. But his Philosophy of Horror book is really fascinating because it gets into kind of the attraction to it. Like I always love hearing people's theories of why certain members of our society kind of gravitate towards the horror genre. Perhaps I'm looking for answers of my own psyche, but whatevs. So yeah, but it's a good explanation of kind of the origins of horror and why it has stuck with us since like the dawn of man, and why it's, just always been part of our, if it's not part of our religion or mythology or storytelling, and why it's always there. So it's kind of just an interesting little psychological glance. Also, it's very heady and textbooky, but if you're also into like reading psychology books, it's totally your bag.
That was that last one of the last things I posted when Wes Craven died away. So that one quote of his, which I think summed up why we're attracted. It was, horror films don't give us nightmares; they set them free. And I remember just going, "Yeah, that's it." In a heartbeat. For most of the people, we're all scaredy cat. Like all the horror people you meet, they were scary kids. They're scared, and this somehow has made them stronger, not the other way around.
We're a sensitive bunch.
Yeah.
My favorite autobiography, Step Right Up America. I'm going to scare the pants off you. I absolutely love. That's William Castle's book.
Oh, cool.
And Crackpot by John Waters is also really fucking good.
And Flying by the Seat of Your Pants, the Samuel Arkoff. That's a good one.
There's a good Todd Browning one too. I can't remember what it was called, but all about the dark. Not Dark Backward, that's a movie, something like that. And it's just a really good Todd Browning one. Also, you mentioned Corman, so the only last book is that new Corman, the Crab Monsters. It's just a beautiful, if you want like the definitive Corman, lots of good interviews, beautiful pictures of all the Corman movies.
It's like all Tom Weaver.
It's an expensive book, but I remember it. I've got a copy. It's beautiful.
You don't remember what it's called?
Crab Monster, Renegade, Bikers, Crab Monsters, and something.
Google Tom Weaver.
It's a brand new book last year. It's really cool though.
Okay, cool.
It's good.
For me, reference book wise, I've always obviously this has changed its meaning, the title, since the internet. But I always loved Fangoria's 101 Best Horror Movies You've Never Seen.
Oh, yeah.
I have a soft spot for that. And also there was a magazine, I can't remember, I'll have to dig it up because I saw it when I was going through my storage recently. Fangoria they put them out every year, but there was one specific horror movie guide, and it had a giant, it was green cover with a giant photo of Jason from part 8. And it was just a video guide reference, like, all the It's Alive movies and all the Psycho movies, all in alphabetical order and a little paragraph about each of them. And, when you're a kid, it's like, oh my God, I'm going to go to the video store and I'm going to circle this one and whatever. So I always love reference stuff like that. So 101 Best Horror Movies, that little magazine.
Even our 300th issue, I found myself still using like that, where I was like, okay, so these are our top 300, which the staff voted on. I was there for the voting.
That one,
and I was
top
still like,
titles.
I've never seen this. I have to go watch this right now. And I still love those reference ones.
I rather like, not that I would seek these movies out, but I liked the Bleeding Skull book.
Oh, I think that's a great book.
Because, I remember we did that episode with Dan Putnick, and it's like, that was the one episode where I barely knew any title mentioned.
Really?
And then I tried to watch one or two of them, and now I know why.
Yeah, Rob and I were talking about this a couple days ago. We both left that episode, found like 4 titles from that book, and went, oh my God, these are awful. This man must be like a film saint if he can make it through these.
That's the thing. It's like, I can't watch VHS horror, but I like reading about it. So,
the crazy stuff involved.
So there's that. There's a book that I was just gifted for my birthday from Dave Parker that I really like a lot, called VHS video cover art, and it's from Tom Hodge, the Dude Designs.
Oh yeah,
you'd know it if you saw the cover.
It's rectangular, purple,
beautiful. I mean, literally every page is just the front cover of another box, and it evokes that feeling of when we used to go to the video stores as kids and just scan the shelves and see what stood out as us. Sort of like that one.
He's coming. He's signing it at the store.
Oh, cool.
He's signing October 10th.
Oh, nice.
Cool. With Pete Von Schally, who just put out a book called The History of Monsters. And it's an art book starting back in caveman days.
Oh, cool.
And, it's one of those where you have 50 things painted on a page, and then on the other side is the silhouettes with a number.
Oh,
and you do that. And it's monsters through the ages.
Wow, that's super cool.
Really cool.
That's
so it'll be the cover art, VHS cover art, and the monster book.
Wow.
There's 2 other books that are really good on the history of VHS art. One's, I think, just called The Lost VHS Art, and it's actually shaped like a VHS
Oh, that's
book.
cool.
And then I can't even remember the other one. Oh, this is going to kill me. It's
I have
a
one like
hardback
that, but
book.
it's called like Grindhouse, but it's not that good.
Yeah, there's a lot that aren't that great. They
It
just
looks
come
like a
out
giant VHS, but it says Grindhouse on the side.
I think that's it. It's like a gray box, and it's got like a big VHS slip cover.
because also you can go online for these. There's some of these online sites.
Some of them are like really obscure and not that cool looking, whereas the VHS video cover art one, like every page is great.
Yeah.
You know,
I
those are all
gotta check
great.
that one out. It looks cool.
And while we're on the topic, so you said that's October 10th at your place.
Right.
Just to clarify, because I know when you do in-stores for DVD or Blu-ray releases, and here's the cool thing, it's like, you know, yeah, I guess if you really wanted to, you could probably, buy a title for a couple bucks less on, say, some Amazon or whatever, but you usually get a lot of people involved with said movie into the place. So to me, it's like, if you really like the title, it's kind of worth it to pay the extra $5 or whatever. It's to have 10 people involved with the movie sign it.
Yep.
And the thing that I think is cool is that you, if you don't live in LA and can't make it down physically to the store, you do offer that option on your website.
We ship it all over the world.
Yeah. So if there's anything that you want signed, you should definitely keep tabs on Dark Delecacies' future events. Because even if you're not in LA, you can still buy a signed copy of it.
You can bring
really cool.
that VHS book and get it signed, even though you didn't buy it. I probably know where Parker bought it.
That's fine. Well, they also have great original posters there. Every time I go there, I always look through your poster section. There'll always be 2 or 3. And I'm like, wow, how did that get? Like something just really interesting.
That's where Parker got my birthday present because he gave me the Italian print of Society. I'll just assume it came from
Wow.
me.
Probably.
Yeah. I've seen a good the burning poster there once before. Always tempting, and they seem reasonably priced. It didn't seem like eBay robbery or.
My wife says we're not running a museum, so
You just want it to move.
Yeah.
It's got to move. Yeah,
Turn it over.
Yeah.
What else, Rob?
Just very lastly, bio. I read this earlier this year. I loved Chainsaw Confidential, Gunnar Hansen's bio.
Yep.
Another thing is I love when these guys do bios about those classic films. I was really disappointed in the Robert Englund one, just because he's, I've interviewed him several times and you see him on all these DVDs. He's such an amazing storyteller. And yet, I guess somebody co-wrote the book with him. Whoever co-wrote it didn't capture that. It's like they kind of...
That's a big thing.
They kind of whiz by like all the Nightmare movies. And granted, there's enough documentaries and stuff out there, but it's like if I'm reading the bio of Robert Englund, I kind of want to know the intimate details of each Nightmare movie and why they made the decisions they did and stuff. Like little things like he originally didn't come back for part 2. And there's one shot in Nightmare 2, which is a stuntman coming out of the steam. And it's awful. It's like the guy's just like really wooden and stuff. And you're like, oh yeah, you need Robert Englund back to do this.
Yeah, interesting.
You're better off with Never Sleep Again for that stuff.
Yeah. So I was a little disappointed that his bio didn't talk about that. Like that's a very important. He almost didn't get to play that role again. But and I haven't read it. But Kane Hodder's bio.
Yeah.
Have you read it?
I have not read it.
I want to check that one out too.
I read that I had him and the guest on when he wrote that. Yeah, I read
The
a long
Killer
time.
and I.
Yeah, no, the start of that is really interesting, where he's talking about how he got burned and some of the stunts that he just kind of went off and tried himself, lighting himself on fire, with just how you learn to do some of these things were actually pretty fascinating.
Wow.
It's a very somber read. It's quite a depressing life. That he had up until he became Kane Hodder that before that it's pretty bleak childhood, and it's just one of those reads.
A nice light read and kind of a bedtime read along this line was Adrienne Barbeau's autobiography.
Oh, wow, okay.
Hasn't she written a few of them?
She's written some vampire novels.
Oh, okay.
But her autobiography was really good. It was right up through about 6 years ago or something.
Okay.
I mean, whenever the book came out.
Wow.
You know who's writing? I actually enjoy Barbie Wilde. She was the female Cenobite.
Yeah.
She's actually done some short stories that I'm like, wow, that's quite good.
Wow. And lastly, just to talk about true crime very briefly. Movie book that leads to true crime. My favorite movie book to this day is still Alfred Hitchcock and the Making of Psycho, for obvious reasons. And we had Stephen Rebello on to talk about Hitchcock, which was a great episode. But leading into true crime, one step further from the Making of Psycho is Harold Scheckler. He did several of them, but I know him through Deviant, which is his true crime book on Ed Gein.
Yeah.
And even further than that, he did a few fiction books, and he wrote one called Outcry, which is a hypothetical fictional story about the son of Ed Gein, like that he had spawned a child that nobody knew about.
Spawn of the devil.
Yeah, which I thought was kind of a neat. I was like, oh, that would make it kind of a cool movie. Like if one of these guys actually had, a secret love child out there.
Son of Gein.
You touch on that point of, that would make a good movie. And people keep going, I get so tired of remakes and redo. And I go, walk into the store. There's 7,000 titles.
Mm-hmm. There's so many.
Make a new movie.
Yeah, exactly. Or a new movie from an old book.
Yeah, absolutely.
In terms of true crime, one of the most riveting reads I've ever had, and it's a tough book to get through, but it made me feel very it just made me feel very odd, like I still didn't have any insight into what happened, is Columbine by Dave Cullen, which is really, really great read and interesting story. Yeah, no, true crime is, you get a well-written true crime it's hard to resist it because they're always page turners, but because we really need to understand. Yeah. We really, just as humans, really, even if it's that's what not possible to understand, we will try to understand.
I've only read a couple of true crime books, but I remember reading, I think it was just called Who Killed My Daughter? And I have to Google this now because I remember being so enthralled in that book that I read it in an evening. I'm Googling it right now. But it was like a true crime book about like a missing girl and her mom's hunt for her, but it was true crime. Hold on. Who Killed My Daughter? And
then there was one written by Jeffrey Dahmer's father.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
My Son the Killer, or my something, whatever the heck the title, which I thought was an odd book.
Who Killed My Daughter? 1992 nonfiction by Lois Duncan, who is actually a regular author.
Right.
It mainly is about fiction author. It's about Duncan's search for answers in the murder of her daughter, 18-year-old Caitlin Arquette. And I don't think I've actually read any Lois Duncan novels, but I read this in school. I think I read it in high school, and I remember just being riveted by it.
Yeah, true crime is it's a weird subgenre, and it is.
I feel like we'll touch on it at some point when the right guest comes who actually is either an author of that, or if Ouija comes back to life and the photographer.
One of my favorite things, whenever I went out of town, I used to, when I could still find it, I used to go out, get something to eat after whatever I was there for the day doing, usually the garment business when I was in the... And I'd go to the newsstand or the drugstore or whatever and try to find a True Detective magazine. Because they were self-contained. They always had the grainy photographs, and they still put the black bars across the eyeballs. Yeah. It was great.
Which makes you want to read into it even more.
Yeah.
Well, this was a great chat, and I'm glad that we finally were able to get down here into the studio.
This is fun.
So
people who visit LA, you should visit this store.
Dark Delecacies, or you can go to...
It's part of the horror crawl. I mean, that's what we've been referring to that area as, like, the horror crawl, just because there's creature features, there's Blast from the Past.
If only Junka had been right next to it.
Bearded Lady, which is Oddities.
I like that place. That place is cool.
Painting Gallery.
Painting Gallery, it's all right there.
Del, you probably can't even count the amount of times I've had a friend in from out of town, and I've brought them to Dark Delicacies.
I didn't know he had that many friends.
Neither did I.
I kept bringing my mom there, and now she walks in and she knows Del by name. And so
what's funny is in the old days it used to be, oh, here come relatives, I got to go to Disneyland again. Now it's you go down to the horror crawl.
Yeah, my mom gets excited because she's like, we're going to go to Porto's, and then we're going to go to Dark Delicacies, and she has like a list of things to do
for
now
dessert. Rocket Fizz.
Fizz. Oh my gosh, yeah, British candy.
And Pinup Girls is there. A lot of people love going there. So.
Great location.
I love you have this one night a month. What's that called? Ladies Night
Out.
And they have all the food trucks out, and it's really cool. It's like that whole block comes to life. I wish it could happen more frequently.
They bring in all
like
these
every
food
Friday.
Trucks. There's this lobster roll truck that shows up
When does this happen?
It's the
last
Friday of every month.
Let's do it this time because it's really cool. And all the stores stay open longer.
I'd love that.
And I always take the dogs and Marnie because you can eat outside. And I'm telling you, try the lobster roll truck. They put crack in
the
their
grilled
lobster
cheese
rolls.
Truck is always there.
They have a basil Munster grilled cheese with mozzarella on it that is like it's amazing.
But it's packed. I mean, the sidewalks
it's really
are
different.
And most of the stores bring out like stuff to sell. It's like a sidewalk sale where they have sales.
Music,
it's
that sounds great.
Fun.
Yeah, sounds great.
Have you ever had a signing during that period? It seems like that would be a cool.
In fact, the one coming up, not September. I think it's October. I think we have Gris Grimley signing.
Oh, okay, yeah, cool.
who is an artist that, you know, a lot of people know. That's October. So that's good. He just came out with Ray Bradbury's Halloween Tree with Chris Grimley art in it. So.
Right. So head over to darkdel.com, correct?
That's it.
And, check out the events and signings and what else they've got going on there.
Equally important, go read a book.
That's the message. Recommend one to us.
Yeah, exactly. Tell us ones we didn't mention on the show.
What are your favorite books? Yeah. There's so many out there to be discovered. So
yeah, that's great.
We will see you guys next week.
Thanks
for having me.
Bye-bye.
Bye.